Beginning sounds like a funny word because if creation is eternal, when did it start? When does it end? It's an eternality, a time frame beyond our limited ability to understand. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, well, today I'm going to suffer as much as I can. It's not part of the equation. They're intoxicated with understanding that this has always been going on and I was just missing it because my perception was limited. How did Shiva and Shakti, if they're universal, unbounded space and time, how did they become limited space and time? How does an ocean become a drop? That's the question. They're a microcosm functioning in this macrocosm. But the unwritten contract with all those Shaktis is they don't want to be exposed. I once asked Swami Lakshman Joo how many people in Kashmir in the last 100 years or so had achieved that level, and he just said, oh, you would be surprised. They also experience this infinite state of knowledge. Their one inward breath takes 30 minutes, and their one outward breath takes 30 minutes. And within the flow of that breath, they see the whole of creation manifesting. It's fascinating. The idea of grace. And the descent of grace or the touch of grace is called Shakti Pata, the touch of energy. Because time only exists when there's some distance between things. If there's no things, then there's no time. The question was asked to Swami, can we travel to these other worlds? And you can go to all these 180 worlds just as Abhinavagupta did.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Potential Paradigms. Today is a deep episode, and we are going to be looking at the spiritual and philosophical tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, often synonymous with Tantra, and some even consider it the distillation of the various schools of philosophy of the Indian subcontinent. Over the last few decades, Kashmir Shaivism has become quite popular in the West and perhaps over the globe, but this was not always the case. The tradition of Kashmir Shaivism has been in hiding for the past few centuries because of the several invasions that happened in India. Because of this, it has been quite challenging for the scholars to weave together the intricate web of Kashmir Shaivism because several of the earlier manuscripts of this oral tradition became extinct. Fortunately for the world, a luminary philosopher sage by the name of Swami Lakshman Joo was around. Swami Lakshman Joo was a descendant in an unbroken chain of masters in the oral tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. He took it upon himself to protect this tradition and freely distribute its knowledge across the world. Over the last 30 years, with the revival of Kashmir Shaivism, there is probably not a single book that does not mention his name. So it's with great delight that I introduce our guest today, George Barselaar, who has been a long-term devotee of Swami Lakshman Joo and a practitioner of Kashmir Shaivism. George took a keen interest in yoga from an early age, which inspired him to learn transcendental meditation, which eventually led him to Swami Lakshman Joo in the Valley of Kashmir, where he spent 9 years with him before his passing in 1991. Since then, George has deeply been involved in publishing several of the works of the teachings of Swami Lakshman Joo in the form of many books, which we will be talking about today. George has a deep knowledge of Kashmir Shaivism, but at the same time, an ordinariness about him, which made it a joy to spend some time with him. This episode is perhaps a great introduction to Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism, but we also looked at the history of this tradition and the very many mystical aspects of this tradition, including the secret of breath, the various gods and goddesses, the Kundalini Shakti, the 118 worlds or realms catalogued by the cartographers and perceptors of this tradition. And last but not the least, we also look at the various means and methods that a seeker can use to realize the truth of their own reality. So before we turn to this episode, I would like to request that you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know how you feel in the comments or leave us a review at iTunes and Spotify. And lastly, we're starting a new channel called the Potential Paradigms Clips. As the name suggests, this channel will have a hand-curated list of clips on specific topics, so you can just focus on the topics that you enjoy and enhance your learning. So I request to check out that channel and please subscribe to it. So welcome, George. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kenan. It's been a long time coming. We've been wanting to do this, and yes, this is a wonderful opportunity. And I would just say that traditionally, when you introduce or have a talk about a spiritual subject, it is traditional to recite a mantra or recite a sloka or some verse. So I'd like to recite a verse that Swami Lakshman Joo himself said was very uplifting spiritually, but he said, in fact, would be uplifting for all mankind. This is a verse that he laid a lot of emphasis on, and the verse itself opens up a whole philosophical, Pandora's box, we could say, because you could write a book about this one particular verse. But I'll recite that, and then we can go on with our interview.
Perfect. Thank you.
Om Agorebio to Gorebio Gore Taribyascha Sarvata Sharva Sarvebhyo Namaste Rudra Rupebhya Agorebhyo to Gorebhyo Gore Taribhyascha Sarvata Sharva Sarvebhyo Namaste Virudra Rupebhya Agorebhyo to Gorebhyo Gore Taribhyascha Sarvata Sharva Sarvebhyo Namaste Virudra Rupebhya. So maybe as we go into the interview, some of the underlying meaning of that will come out. And
yes, thank you for that beginning. So maybe we can start at the very start, George. I mean, as I was saying, Kashmir Shaivism is becoming a popular name in the West and a resurgence across the globe. So how did you became interested in Kashmir Shaivism?
Well, from a very early time of my relationship with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, it was apparent that he had met Swami Lakshman Joo on 3 occasions. 1966, I think, was the first time. Then again in 68 and 69. And Maharishi placed a lot of interest in 2 texts. One was called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which listed 112 different ways to meditate and to transcend and to realize your own inner nature. And the second text was called the Shiva Sutras. And the Shiva Sutras were very, very mystical teachings that were found by a sage more than 1,200 years ago, engraved on a stone, on a huge rock. The rock was actually as big as a house. And this sage had been directed by Lord Shiva himself in a dream or in a very deep meditative state to go and find this rock, read these sutras, and propagate this teaching to the rest of the world, or to all, as much as he could. And the sage's name was Vasugupta. He did that. So I'd been reading these Shiva Sutras since 1974, and various translations. Eventually I came across a translation by Jayadeva Singh, a well-known writer in India on Indology. And he mentioned in that book that whatever I know about this subject, I've gleaned from Swami Lakshman Joo. And that was the first influence that I heard this name. It planted a seed in my mind, and I loved reading the Shiva Sutras for the next 8 years. Then it became inevitable that I should go to Kashmir and meet the person who has translated these verses. So that was my introduction to Kashmir Shaivism, what led me to go to Kashmir. And the moment I sat in the presence of Swami Lakshman Joo, I felt a very strong underlying feeling that here was a master who not only taught theoretically, but lived the experience of everything that he talked about.
Yes, thank you. And as we were sharing earlier in the introduction, that this tradition kind of underwent, because of the invasions, kind of underwent this sort of a hiding. And Swami Lakshman Joo played a pivotal role, which still continues to this day, of bringing Kashmir Shaivism back. And that seemed to be been a very important thing for him to preserve this tradition and bring it out into the world. I was wondering if you could share something about that.
Yeah, if you go back to the origins of this particular tradition, which is called a monistic tradition, it started some 5,000 years ago at the beginning of this era, which is called Kali Yuga. I think everyone's familiar with, if you've studied any Indian philosophy, you're aware of the four different periods of time called Sat Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. It's not unlike what the Greek philosophies have of the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. Each one becoming a little more gross. Iron is obviously grosser than gold, and Kali Yuga is said to be the Yuga of darkness, where knowledge actually subsides. So at the beginning of Kali Yuga, Lord Shiva, who's the custodian, we could say the real custodian of Shaivism, i.e. the name Shiva in Shaivism, the ism of Shiva, appeared to the great sage Durvasa Rishi, who is mentioned in the previous yugas, and he bequeathed him with the job of making sure that Shaivism remained alive for the duration of Kali Yuga, which in human years is said to be 432,000 years. Now, keep in mind, we're only 5,000 years into Kali Yuga, so there's 427,000 years to go. This is in the time sequences as recognized in Indian philosophy. And he basically said, okay, you're in charge of all of Shaivism, and its monistic, its dualistic, and its monodualistic teachings. And Durvasa looked around for yogis who were capable of getting this knowledge which he had received, and he didn't find anybody. He found that in Kali Yuga, the darkness had set in, and all the yogis and worthwhile elevated souls had gone and hidden themselves from mankind. So for 15 generations, something very unique happened. There were mind-born yogis who carried on this tradition, and mind-born daughters. It wasn't a tradition of only men. And up to about the 15th tradition, and then it waxed and waned, we can say, but from about 1200 AD there was enough information there that had come out, about Shaivism, and then with the Mughal invasions, it really went underground for 500 years, and then in 1800 it began to emerge again when the Dogra dynasty and the Maharajas took over Kashmir again, and they were very religious in terms of their love and their devotion to Hinduism. They started to reestablish this tradition, and it was Swami Lakshman Joo's grandmaster, his own immediate master, and himself, who basically took on the mantle of reestablishing this tradition. And, prior to Swami Lakshman Joo coming out and actually being more public about this, there's very little known about Kashmir Shaivism up until about the 1940s. The French scholar Lilian Silbrin was one of the first Westerners to go there. It was still alive in places in India, in Varanasi, and some places in Kerala. There were some little pockets, but nothing that was connected directly to the lineage, the oral tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. And even though it went underground for 500 years, the lineage of masters was not disconnected. So Swami Lakshman Joo was looked upon as the last living master and exponent of the oral tradition of Kashmir Shaivism.
Yes, thank you, George, for this details of the history. One of the ideas I have about Kashmir Shaivism is that it's kind of the cream of the spirituality in the Indian continent, as you were sharing, that it has the philosophical texts, which are monistic, dualistic as well. Do you agree with that? Does that resonate with you?
Um, every tradition, spiritual tradition, will say that they are the cream of philosophy. Whether it's Greek philosophy or whether it's whatever Buddhism or Jainism. Every tradition will feel that this tradition is the highest tradition, and that's absolutely natural. And even Lord Shiva, in the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism, points this out. He says that I have created, if people accept me as the one creator of the universe, then I've created all these different traditions. And in fact, I've created them for a reason, that there is diversity. The universe, a diverse universe. So Kashmir Shaivism does point out differences, but it doesn't officially criticize any other tradition, because that's criticizing the founder of that tradition itself. But of course, if you involve yourself in any tradition and you're devoted to it, you must consider that this is the cream, this is the highest tradition. Until, or if, something within you questions something and feels that there may be something more. And that's what we call the spiritual path, the restless path of a seeker. You put your foot on a path towards a greater understanding of yourself, or some tradition or some philosophy. And as you keep treading and moving, you find new avenues opening up. It's like the more you know, the less you know. And you keep pursuing that. And the uniqueness of Kashmir Shaivism says that the real teacher is yourself, and the inner self of you, which resonates with a teacher, whether it's just a philosophical teacher, whether you have a guru or whatever. If something resonates with you, with your inner self, then that person becomes a guide. That person becomes a guide. But one thing about Kashmir Shaivism that I personally found unique, and I found it when I first met with Swami Lakshman Joo, was that he didn't in any way make you dependent upon him. Tradition in India, Hindus bow down to holy men, and people would bow down to Swamiji and give their pranams and that. But what he was capable of doing, and I saw this over a period of 9 years, he made you feel good about yourself, the first thing, and he made you feel independent in your spiritual path. He laid out before everybody that came to him freely the teachings that he had gleaned from his master, from his video teachers. He laid out those teachings freely and said that everything is contained within these teachings, and it's actually your own story. The story of Kashmir Shaivism is the story of who you are as an individual, how you function in the world. What is this world we function in? So to me, that was very attractive, that there was no pressure to profess devotion, all of these things. You just could catch on to this incredible knowledge, imbibe it into yourself, and see how quickly it resonated, and how quickly that you started to digest this as something that was meaningful to you.
Yes, and in my own exploration, of course, the study of Kashmir Shaivism through Swami Lakshman Joo and the Lakshman Joo Academy, one of the unique things I find in Kashmir Shaivism is the breakdown of the spiritual process. And one aspect of that kind of stands out is the means of how to recognize this supreme reality that you're referring to as Lord Shiva. So there seems like there are different set of means. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what these means are to recognize our relationship with this reality.
Okay, it's a very interesting subject, and one that is probably unique to Kashmir Shaivism in the terminology that's used. The means, the Sanskrit word is upaya. But before somebody even understands that, if somebody comes fresh off the boat, lands at the feet of a Shaiva master, a true Shaiva master, the first thing he will do is orientate them to understand where they are in the scheme of things. What is this creation that we have around us? What is this objective world? How do we perceive this objective world? So the teacher will teach, generally the first subject of most of the teachers is to understand that creation is made up of these building blocks. And like, for instance, in Vedanta, in Sankhya philosophy, they list there are 25 building blocks of creation, from the earth element to water to fire to air to ether, going right up to the state of what's called Purusha. And Purusha means the individual soul. It also means the liberated soul. So 25 what are called tattvas. In Kashmir Shaivism, they recognize there are 36 tattvas. There is something beyond this level of Purusha which has caused this universal state of consciousness to become contracted and live here in a differentiated world. And those 11 extra tattvas are the subtle levels of inner experience that's always going on in the background of everybody's life. The experience of consciousness, how consciousness becomes conscious, how this unbounded ocean of consciousness, which, physics is recognizing now, through quantum physics, and there's something beyond everything that everything comes out of. Kashmir Shaivism goes through an intimate stepping process of how, say, Shiva, through his energy, steps down and not only becomes an individual, but becomes the gross objective world, the earth element. The upayas in Kashmir Shaivism are there so that any individual can understand, where do I fit into these 36 levels? And Shaivism says that, there are basically five states of consciousness. We're either awake, we're either dreaming, we're either in deep sleep, or we're in a state called Turiya or Samadhi, or there's a fifth state, which is where this internal state of expanded consciousness spills back into the world, so that your waking, dreaming, and deep sleep don't become three separate activities, but they become projections onto the screen of your consciousness, the screen of your awareness. And for that, the yogis actually, when they reach that state, they never lose awareness. Even when they go from being awake to dreaming, they're aware that they're dreaming. They're even aware that they're in the very subtle state of deep sleep. Of course, they're aware in the state of Samadhi, because that is the sameness of the Samadhi, the sameness of awareness, the sameness of the intellect. But when that spills back over into their activity, that is the state called Turiyatita, the fourth state being all-pervading in the other three states of consciousness. So upayas, the gross upaya, the lowest upaya, is called anavapaya. It's for people who live in the world and see differentiation everywhere. I'm different from you. You're in another room. You're actually in the same house here, but you're in another room and you're different. And you're Keenan and I'm George. So how do you realize yourself when everything around you seems so different and the world seems in so much turmoil? So the practices within this first upaya, this first means, are practices like mantra recitation, breath, recitation of slokas, all involving, study and everything. There are many means which give us a glimpse behind the state of differentiation that we're caught up in, the time, space, continuum that we're all caught up in a different level. We're all stuck by time and space. The next more subtle level is if a person practices these practices for a considerable period of time, or if they're already quite elevated, they move into a state which is called Shaktopaya. Now, we've all heard the word Shakti, which means energy. So this is the practice which involves energy, and you don't need so many supports to maintain awareness in that state. Shaktopaya means the person who can just go into meditation very easily, and thoughts, even there may be some feeling of faint thinking and activity going on in the mind, but that fades away to a state where awareness is held quite easily. Whereas, say that for the years they might have practiced Anavapaya, it took a while. It took an hour or two, maybe more, to get down to that state. The person in Shaktopaya gets it very quickly. There's a third state, more subtle than that, called Shambhavupaya. Now, Shambhu means Shiva. So the means of Shiva, which means that your awareness is so expanded in that state, there's very little practice at all, but there is still some practice. There is still a process, but it's none of these gross processes of reciting mantra or doing that. It's more, in that level, it's just observing the activity, the subtle activity of the five senses and going deep inside yourself. For instance, a person in Shambhavupaya could listen to a recitation of music, like, say, sitar or whatever, and the energy of that music and the oneness behind those sounds would just take them straight into the deep state of internal awareness. Beyond that, there is an upaya called anupaya, and anupaya means there's no upaya at all, nothing to do. This is a spontaneous thing where somehow, by the grace of practice in the past, maybe even past lives or whatever it is, that person, be they a yogi, a bogi, a man or a woman, a child, a young, adult, we could say, or an elder, suddenly this dawning happens automatically without having done anything. And this has happened. This has happened to people. It's recorded, that people suddenly get this wake up, and all of a sudden their life has changed. The whole dimension of their life has changed, and they're living a reality which is now expanded and universal. It's very rare, we should say. Generally, people have to tread through the four upayas, but it's not uncommon that it can happen to very elevated souls. And I'll mention one more point about this. The upayas are an essential part of the understanding of these 112 practices that were given out in earlier mentioned, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. And in that 112 practices, many of them are Anavapaya practices, but some are a mixture of Anavapaya and Shaktopaya. And some are Shambhavapaya, purely Shambhavapaya practices. There are no practices in that of Anupaya, because Anupaya is no practice. It's just a spontaneous recognition of your own nature, who you are, that your inner nature is divine. It always has been divine. And there's just this period of time when I seem to be in a state of amnesia, of forgetting who I was, and that I was the thing that I was always searching for.
Yes, thank you so much, George. I think that for the audience and for myself as well, since we're talking about the map and the various means of attaining the realization, maybe we should talk a little bit about what the realization is, what this awareness is. And maybe I can check with you. The way I understand it is that it is the realization of unity, of oneness, of creation. Because normally our perception is differentiated. We see many things. And to see that there's actually a unity behind that is not just to see the unity, but also our relationship and connection with this unity is what the upayas achieve. So I kind of give it to you, and you can say it in the way which is probably much better.
No, anything that I'm presenting here is what I have learned from the lips of Swami Lakshman Joo. being around him, but not only in the theoretical teachings, but in the practical day-to-day life of how he lived. So it became obvious to me, being around such an elevated soul, that there is a state of universal consciousness. And this was exhibited on a number of occasions, I mean, many times, but completely covered up by Swami Lakshman Joo. He used to really shun any recognition of his state of consciousness, would never call himself enlightened, would just say, I'm just an ordinary person in the world like you. But go on meditating, because you can achieve your own universality. So what is this state? What is this goal? It's a state of universal consciousness, which is in the background of everybody's life. It's in the background not only of human beings. This universal consciousness is in the background of every living being, from the tiniest bug up to what you would call the demigods, or the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva of the Trinity of philosophy in India. So what is the difference? Why is it not accessible? And Kashmir Shaivism would explain that in the beginning, although, beginning sounds like a funny word, because if creation is eternal, when did it start? When does it end? It's an eternality, a time frame beyond our limited ability to understand. But they say that in the beginning, there was only consciousness. There was this ocean of consciousness, which wasn't just a flat ocean. It was an ocean with tides moving in huge fluctuations within the ocean, but the ocean hadn't risen up into any waves as yet. It was just an ocean of consciousness. There wasn't even the concept of I-ness. It was just consciousness. But consciousness did stir within itself, and when it rose up, consciousness reflected within itself as to, what am I? Now, this comes out in some of the Upanishads and some of the teachings. But in Kashmir Shaivism, that rising up is considered to be what's called Shakti. The rising up is the feminine energy rising up from the ocean of Shiva's consciousness and recognizing itself through the avenue of awareness, which in Sanskrit is called Vimarsha. Shiva is called Prakasha, the light of consciousness. Shakti is called Vimarsha, the awareness which makes one capable of perceiving itself, which makes Shiva capable of perceiving himself. And this combination of Shiva and Shakti is so intimate. They're not really two different things. They're one thing that has come out of this ocean of oneness, monism, and in the process of coming out and enfolding within itself, this recognition of this inner nature spilled over, and that's what we have. We have creation. Creation is the spilling over of the intense love and intertwining of Shiva and Shakti in a cosmic dance. And Shiva and Shakti are up there at the 36th and the 35th level of these tattvas that we just talked about. Everything below that, from the 34th down to the earth tattva, the first tattva at the lowest level, is just a manifestation of, we can say, this space and time, energy of consciousness, and the holder of that spilling over down into different levels of creation, becoming more and more gross, and coming right down to the level of the individual, where at the individual level, we have forgotten all that. It's there in the background, but we've forgotten where we came from. We say, I came from my mother and father. Actually, the real mother and father are Shiva and Shakti, because they're the mother and father of the universe. And a beautiful thing in Kashmir Shaivism that I came across in Swamiji's teachings is that he said that actually the same way that Shiva and Shakti create the universe is exactly how two human beings, when they come together and consummate in the sexual act, create a life. There's no difference. It's a microcosmic event of how the macrocosm came about. And that I find really intriguing and very beautiful in Kashmir Shaivism.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I would love to maybe go into that. You shared a few things, but maybe we can get into this first. I find that in Kashmir Shaivism, what is very unique is the sacredness of not just the creator and our connection with the creator, but also the sacredness of creation itself, which I find is different because oftentimes or sometimes in monistic traditions, non-duality, the creation is considered an illusion, something that one has to transcend. Whereas Kashmir Shaivism, as you were sharing, it says Shakti as this creationary aspect, which is equally sacred. So maybe we can get into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think everyone would be familiar that most of the traditions that have come out of India were recognize the value of renunciate tradition. I have to renounce the world in order to overcome its pull and push in different directions that take me away from awareness of my own nature, my own inner nature. And that's very logical. That seems to be very real. What I find interesting is that in Kashmir, there never really was a renunciate tradition. Kashmir Shaivism is considered to be a householder tradition, that there's nothing to give up. But what we have to do, we have to give up our ignorance of what's actually going on. That's the only thing to shun. And there is no physical substance that actually takes us away from that understanding. There isn't a physical substance that's made us ignorant. The only thing that's made us ignorant is lack of complete knowledge. So seeing the world differentiatedly is ignorance. And not seeing it undifferentiatedly is also ignorance. Both of those things. And they were the very second sutras of the Shiva sutras given to Vasugupta, some 1200 years ago. The first one was Chaitanyam Atma. Everything is made of consciousness. And not seeing that in oneness is ignorance. And seeing it in oneness is also ignorance. So there's two aspects to knowledge. There's limited knowledge and there's unlimited knowledge. Unlimited knowledge is when you realize your own nature and you realize that your limited soul, which has been playing out this drama in everybody's life, our own dramas. We all have our own dramas. We all have our own little bubble that we live in. This limited soul has never been disconnected from the universal soul of consciousness. And in a sense, Kashmir Shaivism says Shiva and Shakti have expanded themselves in the hearts of all living beings. Shiva and Shakti see through the eyes and the senses of all living beings. But in this play, they willfully, they not so much will, but they have this acceptance of becoming limited in order that they can again retrace their steps and come back to their own real nature. So it's like a diving down into gross creation and then having this realization, hold on a second, there is something much more going on here. Some space opens up in a person's heart and goes, what am I doing? What's going on? And what's the meaning of life? It can come in any way, shape, or form. Then that person puts their foot, they tread on a path which is heading back in the direction of understanding where they came from. It may take many lifetimes because, Indian philosophy recognizes that we have millions of lifetimes where we come and go until we get it right, they say. So Kashmir Shaivism says this is the play of consciousness. This is the play of Shiva and Shakti, the masculine and feminine energy playing out in the world. And the world itself, this objective world, first part of your question, is itself a manifestation of consciousness. It isn't something to be shunned so much, but it is something to be understood for what it really is.
Yes, absolutely. I think that each one perhaps of each one of us has our own path, and this is something that's deeply resonated with me. And to hear that the world is an illusion was something that didn't quite sit well, something didn't feel right, and that sort of led me to explore more. So maybe to dive a little bit more into this, in the Sufi pantheon, I love a quote which is, I'm just going to paraphrase it. It's from the Prophet Muhammad, which says, "I was a hidden treasure and wanted to be known, and thus I created the world," which is to kind of from God saying, "Why did I create creation?" And I wanted to check how you would interpret that in the language of Kashmir Shaivism. But to me, when I heard that, it really resonated in the sense that the world is an expression of God, and everything that we see and all the roles we play is an exploration of God consciousness and can happen in this place that we call creation. So by living this life well, you somehow also fulfill God in a way.
Yeah, the key, the underlying sentence there is living this life well. And if we look around us and look at the world today, so many people are not having the opportunity to live this life well because there seems to be so many pressures and so much happening in the world. We won't go into politics because according to Shaivism, if there is only one being that created this whole universe, then everything that's happened, even all the suffering and everything, is also part and parcel of that play. And every opportunity in life is an opportunity to understand ourselves. And it's formulated that sometimes God, call it whichever way you look at it, shakes the world up in order for people to wake up, you know? And this has happened through time, huge catastrophes. People wake up after these big events that are so horrific, but then they very quickly sort of slip back into just accepting, how things are going. So that is again the play of consciousness manifesting itself through the lives of so many different people, so many different beings, so many different cultures. And mankind at the moment there's a renaissance of consciousness, not just in Kashmir Shaivism, as you mentioned at the beginning, but there was a time when, I used to live in Los Angeles. When I first went there more than 25 years ago, just to visit, you could go around, Santa Monica and all these places, and you would just, see the hippie culture, the tail end of the hippie culture. Within the next 10 years, wherever you went, you'd see somebody carrying a yoga mat, and then after that, you would see this transition into, oh gosh, everyone's not only going to yoga, they're going to listen to bhajans being recited. And then it went on to that, where even some of the universities were opening up, study courses on Shiva Sutras and on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And then there was this huge wave of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism that came in, and also, Zen Buddhism. So this whole flow is a flow of collective consciousness moving towards a greater understanding. And whichever path a person gets involved in, that's their, we can say, karma, that's their nature to be involved in that path. So from the big picture, it's everything's okay. From the little picture, oh, this is wrong, that's wrong, that guy's doing that and they're not going to achieve anything. We can criticize all of that. But then we have to reflect on how our perception is affecting our own inner spiritual path. And if we're criticizing everything around us, then our meditation is full of thoughts and full of ideas and full of, conspiracies about this and that. If we're touched by a very powerful descent of grace, you start to see a pattern in all this. You start to see a divinity even in things where you never saw it before. And the first divinity that you have to find is within yourself, within your own body, within your own mind, within your own ego, intellect, within your own nature. And it's there, deeply hidden in the soul of all living beings. This thirst for goodness, this thirst for enjoyment, this thirst for bliss. It's the most natural thing of the human race, the entire species of planet Earth. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, well, today I'm going to suffer as much as I can. It's just not, it's not part of the equation. So,
Yes, thank you. Earlier, you were mentioning that Shiva and Shakti, out of their love for each other, out of their joy, they create this world. And to me, it seems like part of our journey is to discover that again, that the source, even though we kind of live in this apocalyptic world right now, that even behind all of our turmoils and challenges, the foundation is joy and love.
it certainly is. And I think on a practical level, we can talk about these 5 principles of consciousness and Shiva and Shakti, but in a sense, anybody on the spiritual path, we're eager to know, what can I gain from this? What can I get out of this? There is still, until one reaches a state of, say, complete enlightenment, there is still a selfishness in the sense of the small self, small s, in trying to find out what the big self is, the capital S. There's a selfishness which can also interpret itself as a devotion to the path that I'm on. That I really want to know this. I really want to get this. So I'm kind of I'm spending a lot of time in this. I'm devoting myself to this. So in the initial stage, as we step on this spiritual journey, which is different again for everybody, there's a passion within each of us that just opens up a space to be able to entertain a greater reality. And at first, that greater reality is always there in knowledge. We gain some knowledge. Someone says, I come to a yoga class. No, I don't want to do yoga. It sounds, silly. But you go and suddenly something happens. Wow, I feel really good. And all I did was bent my body and rolled all over the floor. And a person does that, I'm going to come back. And they do that for 6 months, a year or whatever. And then all of a sudden somebody says, wow, I was reading this thing about the Shiva Sutras, or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is the origin of where this yoga came from. It's a progression. And if the person is open to that, they continue along this progression. Some people get it straight away. Some people go along and learn a mantra and learn how to meditate, and it's very apparent from their inner experience, even without reading any books. This is really apparent. This is a very relaxing experience, but it's more than just that. It's more than just deep sleep. So the path is basically the same. It's from a state of completely knowing nothing to the state of knowing everything. Jivan Mukti, it's called, or liberation. But the pathways are infinite. Infinite.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about the greater reality. And I feel like in my life, and perhaps that resonates with a lot of spiritual sadhakas, that we get disappointed. We hit challenges, we see troubles, we see the state of the world, and somehow we have this deep intuition that there has to be something beyond this. There has to be a greater reality. And that somehow guides us piecemeal towards this unity, and to see, as you were saying, that everything is okay in spite of all that's going on. But also that what I think you're highlighting is that the practicality of the practices of any tradition, in this case Kashmir Shaivism, gives us the tool to become courageous warriors and become creative beings in this world, to what I was referring earlier to, a well-lived life.
Okay, we'll come back to basics again. So what is it that establishes a person on the spiritual path, firmly on a spiritual path, whatever spiritual path? And it has to be practice. It's called abhyasa in Sanskrit, your spiritual practice. And for some people, it might just be, I mean, many people in India, their practice is just doing some little puja in the morning and then reading the Bhagavad Gita, maybe a chapter a day. That's their practice. And that keeps them steady, the wheels on the tracks. Probably the most universal of all practices, and I would say not probably, but definitely, is meditation. And there's mantra meditation, there's meditation on breath. And Kashmir Shaivism places a lot of emphasis on meditation and breath. In fact, the very first practice of the 112 practices that Shiva talks to or gives to Shakti, or in that text, it's Bhairava and Bhairavi, were just synonymous names with Shiva and Parvati, or Shiva and Shakti. Bhairava teaching Bhairavi his feminine nature. What is the reality? She asks, okay, if you're everywhere, how do I realize you? And he says, well, if I'm everywhere, there's no way to realize me because I'm already everywhere. Where do you go? And she says, no, come on, give me some idea. And he says, okay, I'll give you 112 ways to realize who you are, i.e. the state of Bhairava. But I'm telling you in the first place that you already are that. And when you reach the goal, first thing you're going to realize is, oh my God, I always was that. This underlying consciousness that I've been looking for through all these practices was always there. It was never absent. And that's why in Kashmir Shaivism, Swami Lakshman Joo tells us the first experience that a yogi, a practitioner, experiences when the dawning of enlightenment happens, or when they have this incredibly expansive experience, which takes them out of their limited perception of the world, the first thing is they realize that it was always there. The second thing is they're filled with amazement, he says. Yeah, Chamatkara, they're filled with the state. They're just amazed at how it all works. And they walk around, he said, for sometimes in a state of intoxication. Others might think they're drunk. They're intoxicated with understanding that this has always been going on, and I was just missing it because my perception was limited. So this practice of breath, the reason it's so important in Kashmir Shaivism is in the deeper philosophical text, the question is asked, how did Shiva and Shakti, if they're universal, unbounded space and time, how did they become limited space and time? How does an ocean become a drop? That's the question. How does Shiva and Shakti become George and Claudia and all of these other my friends, John, Denise, Shana, who I work very closely with? How did we all become little drops in this ocean of consciousness? And Kashmir Shaivism explains that what happened when Shiva and Shakti danced together, and when this spilt over into creation, the first manifestation was a thing called prana, breath. And the first manifestation was called pranana Shakti, the energy of breath, not individual breath, the energy of breath, which is everywhere. That energy of breath is the first manifestation of this ocean into becoming infinite number of drops, or infinite number of small oceans, or whatever. So the connecting rod for any individual, any being, any insect, we can say, from the lowliest mosquito up to the level of just below Shiva and Shakti, is the connection of breath. So Kashmir Shaivism places, and Buddhist practices, many traditions, Thich Nhat Hanh, from the awareness of breath. mindfulness. And it's what people do naturally anyway. The moment you're in a turmoil, you take a deep breath, or somebody tells you you're upset, take a deep breath. There's more to it than just taking a deep breath. Kashmir Shaivism goes into intimate details about how the breath works, not only from this breath which is flowing out through creation, but how it works within the body. And everybody knows the first and last thing we do in this lifetime is breathe. We take a breath when we start, we let the breath out when we go, and that's it for what we call life, our life. So on a practical level, again, people do their meditation practice. The goal of the meditation practice is to reconnect ourselves. And since breath, this prana, which has flown out at that highest level, expanded itself and become these little access points for all individuals to connect to that divinity, is within our breath. I mean, it's so technical in Kashmir Shaivism. The texts talk about that every individual breathes 21,600 times a day. That's 4 seconds per breath, 2 in, 2 out. That's average breathing. And they say that take out 8 hours for sleep. So 10,600 times, you have 10,600 opportunities to reconnect yourself with the essence of who you are. But there's a trick, and the trick is not just in the movement of the breath. The trick is in understanding the turning points in the breath, where the breath turns around. When you breathe out, there's a pause before you breathe in. And at the end of breathing in, there's a pause. And these junctions or gaps that they're called are the connecting rod with a much greater reality that is all around us all the time. And that's the key factor in Kashmir Shaivism. And that's one of the practices that before he left this world, Swami Lakshman Joo gave this one practice. This is a universal practice, which was just to watch your breath, be aware of your breath, but be aware of the turning points in breath, how the breath turns around. Be conscious of that. So and it happens naturally for a lot of people too. Runners have what they call the runner's high, where if you're jogging and you're jogging and you're jogging and your breath becomes very apparent to you, runners go into this state where all of a sudden they're not even running. It's all going automatically because they've actually entered the junction point. They don't even feel like they're breathing. The breath feels like it's going on automatically. Very healthy athletes all have this experience. It's called the zone. You go into the zone because you're focused so much. And the breath always changes when you go into the zone. So this is on a practical level. Anybody can do this. We breathe 21,600 times a day. For those, and you can, there's 21,006 opportunities to observe and to reconnect with the source of our own life. But people sleep 8 hours. Although last night you said you didn't sleep so well, so you had 21,600 opportunities. Insomniacs, there you go. You can just meditate on the breath. I'm being a little bit crazy there, but it's
why not? And I think what you're highlighting is the practical approaches that Kashmir Shaivism provides, and this is one of the techniques in the book you mentioned, Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. Just because it's like a classic book which has already 12 methods to attain this recognition that we have been speaking of. And it's also interesting, as you were saying, that there's such an emphasis on finding the junction points of the breath. And two things that come to me is, one is the word being spiritual itself comes from spiritus, which is breath. So being spiritual is to breathe in the proper way, or to find the junctions, as you say. And also to check with you, in the Buddhist tradition, there is this idea of the bardos, or the in-between states, which happen earlier you were also talking about we have waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And in between, when we shift from one state to the next one, there is a gap. And so is this the same gap that's in these turning points of the exhale and the inhale? And would this be also the same as what is being referred to as these bardos in Buddhism?
I think there's a connection, but in our waking state, if a person sits down to do a practice, they are very much aware of the flow of the breath to start with. And then they become, as time goes by, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, you become more aware of these turning points, this small pause. It isn't something that you can focus on because it's very abstract at first. But it continues over periods of time. When a person practices regularly, those pauses somehow open up to a greater expansion. Not that your breath expands. Your breath might slow down and become very, very still. So, yeah, this pause is there between waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and even going into the state of Turiya. There's a gap. But what people who meditate a lot find that when they start to go into the dreaming state, they don't experience the pause, but what they find is they feel that they're aware that they're dreaming. And I'm not talking about lucid dreaming, where you can just change your dreams and go with them and wake up in the morning and remember what you dreamt. This is an awareness which is outside of the dream that's going on. I'm aware that I'm dreaming. And that happens in the early stages. That's a sign that your meditation is actually working, that something is spilling over into a state where your ego isn't involved. It's very easy for us to say, oh, I had this incredible meditation. I had this universal experience, unbounded experience. If it doesn't show up in a state when your limited ego is subsided, then usually they're fleeting. They come and go. So long-term practitioners of meditation in all the traditions start to have this experience of awareness during dreaming at first. Awareness during deep sleep is a very, very deep experience, because in deep sleep, the breath is very, very subtle. There's no thoughts, there's no dreaming, there's no pictures going on in your brain. And yet somebody's aware that I'm actually laying there sleeping. Some people have the experience that they hear somebody snoring in the room and they think to themselves, gosh, I thought I was the only one sleeping in this room. And then the next thing they go, oh, gosh, that's me sleeping. So where am I? I'm down there sleeping and I'm snoring. What is this? And usually they just fall back into sleep and it's gone. But it's an experience where consciousness shows us that consciousness is beyond just the body. There are all of these. There's now infinite number of experiences, near-death experiences, where people have come out of the body and seen themselves from above or whatever being operated on the operating theater, or gone to some other world, and then they come back. So what went and what came back? What went is our own consciousness went off into a different dimension, because the underlying consciousness is everywhere in all dimensions. And it's very easy to get caught up in our experiences and start to dwell on them and start to express them and whatever. The unique thing in Kashmir Shaivism is that the real yogis never express their experience. They never reveal their inner experience, because they don't want to create a difference between them and their students. They go on teaching, and the main underlying principle of the teaching is to make the student completely independent, to know that each time that student sits down, that there's nowhere to go. Consciousness is everywhere already. There's nowhere to go. But the practice you're doing will bring you to a realization of that, a realization of your own inner nature, your divine nature, that's there underlying all the time.
George, the gap that you mentioned that's between deep sleep, waking, and dreaming, that is there all the time throughout these three states.
Yes. Yes. There's a state called Turiya, the fourth state. And Turiya is the screen on which the other three states are projected. We could say, if you go into a movie theater, the old movie theaters, this curtain used to open up, there was a blank screen, and then there was this light projected from the back of the theater that would stream through. And of course, in the old days, the 60s, everyone was smoking. So you could see the movie, halfway up to the screen because it was already projecting. So the screen of consciousness is always there. We superimpose everything around us. This room around me, I superimpose that on the consciousness, the conscious light of my perception. So there's four states of consciousness that we know of: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, Turiya. Let's put Turiya Atita, where that spills over back into activity, aside for the moment. So these three states of consciousness with which everybody is familiar, waking, dreaming, and sleeping, are like projections onto the screen of the fourth state. The fourth state is the background of everything that's happening. Right now, you can perceive, or I can perceive, this room around me. I've projected this onto the screen of my consciousness, which is not a one-dimensional, two-dimensional screen. It's a multi-dimensional screen. It has infinite space around me. When I go to sleep and I go into the dreaming state and I'm dreaming and I'm seeing myself in the dream, I'm again projecting from within myself onto the screen of consciousness. If there was no screen there, you couldn't see the dream. And the source of the screen itself is the light of consciousness, we say. That's why we had this discussion last night. In the dreaming state, if you're in a very dark room, maybe it's cold winter, you pull the blankets up over your head, you have a dream, you can still see what's going on in the dream. Where's that light coming from? Where is the light that's lighting up the dream? That's the inner light within each and every one of us. And even in the deep sleep state, which is not Turiya, there's still some activity going on, there's still some subtle breath. That is a state projected onto the screen where, in that state, there isn't any movie going on. There's no movie of what's happening in the dream. There's no movie, which is this movie that I've created for myself today. That's all been, the projector's turned off there, but the state of deep sleep is still projected onto that state of consciousness. The yogi who goes beyond that through deep meditation, and this state of called Samadhi, or the fourth state, requires that the breath actually stops. When they go into that state, they're experiencing the screen itself. But that screen, that internal screen, is usually an experience of what's called Samadhi. Sama meaning the sameness of awareness. When a yogi experiences that state and becomes very familiar and maintains that state, and through their own inner grace, something else expands within them. They start to find that there is incredible fluctuation going on within this silence. It's not just flat silence. It's infinite potential within that silence. And when that bubbles up, what happens to those yogis that are blessed with a state of what's called anugraha, or grace, from within themselves, the grace of Shiva to reveal himself through this energy of Shakti, this inner silence spills out back into activity, and they come out through their perception and they find that there's two things happening simultaneously. There's vibration of the whole universe vibrating, and there's no vibration in the silence of their own inner being. And this is the term called spanda. Kashmir Shaivism has written extensively on this concept of spanda, vibrationless vibration. And therefore, for the Shaiva yogis, the state of enlightenment, the state of internal samadhi is a dynamic state. It's not a neutral state where they just go into this silent bliss and then they come out and they're more joyful in the world. This joy, this inner joy, has to spill over into the world to where they see the whole world is actually vibrating in this awareness, in this consciousness, which itself is made of pure bliss. So, I mean, we're getting into some very heady things here. And how does it, again, reconnect? We all have that. And we have that in different experiences throughout our life. People have these euphoric experiences. And Swami Lakshman Joo says, these euphoric experiences come and go, and they're like just a teaspoon, a tablespoon, or maybe a small plate of that infinite ocean of bliss and consciousness that's there available. And we tap into it at different times.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. And thank you. I think there are a lot of deep themes here. And perhaps one of the things that you are clarifying for us here is that what is this quote unquote enlightenment or recognition? And as you're saying, is that as we enter into this junction, which is a doorway into another world, which is always there, it's just not recognized. And as it is recognized, there are levels of this recognition that eventually the final step is to bring this background into the foreground.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, this maybe it's also good to clarify a bit, because in the wider world, I think Kashmir Shaivism differs a little bit as to what is this enlightenment. As one of the things that you were mentioning is that being aware of your dreams while you are dreaming, and being aware of your deep sleep while you're in that deep sleep, which a lot of people, at least in the Western world, would say that that's not the case. When I'm in deep sleep, it's like a computer being turned off. There is no recognition of that. But yes, so I wanted to kind of check with you, because oftentimes someone could have a non-dual experience or a big awakening of unity consciousness, and then come back to your normal differentiated perception, where it's you and me and the manyness, and yet claim one can start to see, oh, I'm awakened. And that seems to happen quite a lot. But in the view of Kashmir Shaivism, the way I understand from you is that would not be a case. That would just be a temporary glimpse, and there's still work to be done.
Yeah, that's true. We know that it's a kind of spiritual surface out there these days. If you go on YouTube, put in the word Tantra and you get 136,000 hits that come up. That word is mentioned, that many times. Put in the word tantric sex and you probably get, 200,000. And there's a lot of people having these experiences and then immediately setting themselves up as teachers. And that's fine. That's also part of the play. I salute them and I say, that's good. And they have their followers and they have that. No conflict at all in the world of Shaivism. But the reality is that if one does align oneself with a teacher, it should be that teacher frees them up to realize their own inner potential and doesn't make them dependent upon the teacher. The teacher, in a tradition, like an oral tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, the teacher is the knowledge which has flown out from 5,000 years ago through the words of each of these teachers in this unbroken lineage, and which is placed before those deserving disciples. So the teacher is actually contained within the knowledge that has been handed down. And one checking point there is that the teacher should never contradict itself. The teaching itself, if it's a pure teaching based on absolute truth and universal consciousness, at every point, at every step, out of the mouths of all the different masters of the past, it should flow in the same way. It doesn't something that was said here doesn't contradict something over here. It may be a different system, and Kashmir Shaivism clearly recognizes the four different systems within its teaching related to the four different upayas or methods or means. There's the Spanda system, which has its own texts and relates to people who practice in the world. There's the Krama system, which relates to people who are in the state, who have more of a refined awareness in the states of Shakti. Now, then after Spanda and Krama, there's the Trika system, we can say, or Kaula system. Kaula system, well, Trika's beyond all of these. That was a mistake to put Trika in there, because Kaula system relates to what's called the practitioners of Shambhavapaya, very elevated awareness. And the Anupaya, the final one, relates to the system called Pratyabhijna, instant recognition, or self-recognition that happens spontaneously. So these different levels are there, and the prerequisite for any of these levels, the prerequisite is the grace that opens up within the heart of any individual that allows them to become aligned with any one of these parts, any one of these levels of the tradition. A person who's capable of Shambhavapaya may start in a lower tradition and very quickly rise to that, because that's their inner nature. They already have a very expanded perception of the world. So it's part of the reason why in Kashmir Shaivism masters don't talk about their experiences, and they don't advise students to reveal the deep inner experiences that happen in their spiritual practice. Because if they do that, then everybody thinks, oh, I'm not having that experience, so there's something wrong with my practice. Or that person had that experience, I should have that experience too, because that's the pathway to enlightenment. But that's not the case. If Shiva and Shakti have manifested in the hearts of all beings, and they're playing in our life, they can wake themselves up at any moment through any means that they want. So you see that view, that is a monistic view, which can get people into trouble. When people say, well, it's all oneness, if it's just Shiva and Shakti, fine, I can do anything, I'm Shiva. But if you don't have that experience and it's just a thought, you'll end up in trouble. If it's just an idea, if it's not a genuine reality. So if it does become a genuine reality, and you are given the internal permission from that higher resonance or higher being to teach, then your teaching will be completely in accord with that universality, and you will be elevating people just in your presence. You'll be elevating people, but you'll be elevating them through the knowledge which has flown down through those traditions. There's a very clear tradition of the masters of Kashmir Shaivism that I can talk about. Shankara has his own tradition, the Shankaracharya tradition, and there's a very clear definition of the lineage of how that tradition started from, Narayana and went down through Vashishta, Vyasa, and Shankaracharya and his four disciples. And that Shankaracharya tradition still continues in India today, the four main sheets of Shankaracharya. And the Shankaracharyas have been very, very elevated souls, guided people, not just people in the renunciate Shankaracharya tradition, but guided householders. Some of them were more stoic for the renunciate tradition, and some were very, very elevated who saw that this tradition is for everybody, no caste, creed, color, gender restrictions. So it comes down to a thing of grace, which is a very important part of the teaching of Kashmir Shaivism. and the
Yes.
words of the master. And I'll just mention one thing here, which I found really unique. When I first went to Kashmir, I met John and Denise Hughes, who had been living there already for more than 10 years and studying with Swami Lakshman Joo. And John had he loved electronics. In fact, he built his own computer in the 70s. He started building a computer when it first came out with those big bands. And he built a computer by 1982 or 83. He built a personal computer for himself to transcribe the lectures that he'd recorded. And it was as big as a kitchen table. Carried chipboards, and he carried, all this stuff over there. So when I met John and Denise, they'd already recorded about 600-700 hours of lectures. And over a period of time, John published 3 books. The first one was called Secret Supreme, which was the essential teachings that he got from Swami Lakshman Joo when he first went in 72. The second one was the Shiva Sutras. And the third book, which was published in 2000, that was 2002. The second book was called Self-Realization in Kashmir Shaivism, based on some lectures that Swami had given. And each of these, John edited the audio files and put them out. Then we came to the realization in a small group that there is something in this, not only just the words of an enlightened master, but the actual teachings come through in the sound of the voice. And it was from 2002 onwards that the decision was made, rather than publish edited books, why don't we release the original audios so that a person listening to the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism get it directly from Swami Lakshman Joo's own teachings. And this was a revelation for a lot of people. It also saved us the thing of, if we make a mistake in editing, that mistake is there, it's etched in stone. That book is out there. But there may be people out there, and this has been our experience, that are much more elevated than us, who hear just one thing that Swamiji said and go really deep into what it actually means on many different levels. We often get emails and said, I was listening to this tape and my gosh, it went through me, and something opened up to where I realized the great truth or reality about my own level of being and my own inner experience. And we're thankful. We say, that's fantastic. That's what Swamiji said would happen. That's what Swami Lakshman Joo said would happen even after he left this world. He said this tradition will continue through the work that John and Denise did for some 16 years of meticulous recording all of the lectures. And remember, Swami Lakshman Joo didn't sit down and just talk verbatim as we're talking now, or, just impromptu. He only taught from the ancient texts that were discussions. They were called the tantric texts, which are the discussions between Shiva and Shakti. One exception was that he taught a book called the Tantra Loka, which was basically given out by this great Shaiva master, Abhinavagupta, some, 1,000 years ago, or who brought together, through his own universal direct experience of enlightenment, brought together the essence of Shaivism and gave out a teaching based on the one core teaching which makes Kashmir Shaivism unique, which was called the Malini Vijaya Tantra. So that has, for many people, made they don't have to travel to Kashmir to sit there for years and years in the cold winters and been very pleasant in some of it, very stark winters. They don't have to do. They can actually hear all the original recordings, and that's what an oral tradition is. An oral tradition is not. It's not just what's being said; it's how it's being said, who's saying it, and the level of consciousness that person is coming from in what they're saying.
Yes, wonderful. George, I wanted to kind of ask you a couple of questions on what we were just talking about, the grace, but also the 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 basis of this realization or the details of this realization, because often here in the West, not just in the West, in Neo Advaita and in Advaita as well, once you are told that you are that reality or you have some intuition or perhaps an experience, that's where the buck stops. And in my own experience and or friends I know, at some level one knows that the journey is not finished. There is a lot of work to do, although that it sounds paradoxical. So I wanted to refer this paradox to you because it's been a struggle to me, and I know it's a struggle for a lot of people, because even if you keep telling yourself, and after a while it becomes like an echo chamber where your group of friends and everybody is like, okay, we are the self and nothing has to be done, but yet there is hidden some scaras or trauma that a sakta can come across, and that it doesn't make sense. How come I am this reality, and yet I in the various states of waking or deep sleep, that doesn't stay with me. So what is, because it does sound paradoxical, right? And that's when when you were talking about the levels or of the various means, the Anupaya, Shaktapaya. Even when you were referring to the story of Shiva speaking to Shakti, he was telling her that the simplest way is you're already that. So how does one reconcile this paradox, or there is no need to reconcile?
Look, there is a need to reconcile, and that's what practice is about. From the point of view, Swami Lakshman Joo himself would say, yeah, actually in reality, there's nothing to be done. If you are already Shiva and you've just forgotten that, so okay, you are Shiva. You remember it? Fine, well and good. If you don't remember it, fine, you're still Shiva. But then he would say to him, but don't stop practice. And the reason practice is so important is because it changes our perception of who we are internally and perception of the world around us. So when a person does practice regularly, even any meditation technique, the first thing that they should notice is the world around them becomes a little bit softer. The hard edges of the world, the hard edges of this objective world or of their own reality somehow becomes a little softer. And things which were unsurmountable problems drop away. I'm talking about someone who does regular practice, not somebody who practices once and has this idea that I'm all unbounded and everything. That, you can hold on to that, but that's a thought. That's not a feeling. That's not a direct feeling of what's going on. That's a thought. That's a thought concept. It can, for elevated people, they can have that. Like, who am I? Ramana Maharshi's famous technique, the great saint from South India. If somebody's elevated enough, that can actually transform them internally. But the real transformation has to happen in your perception of the world. And what happens is, if a person wants to experience this unified state of consciousness and they start to move towards that, the world will change around them. The time and space in which they're living will change, and change in a very subtle way. It's like you're working really hard for the whole year, and all of a sudden you go on vacation and everything changes. The 24 hours of the day doesn't change, but you seem to have more time and the space around you is greater. For the person who's practicing, religiously, when I say religious, twice a day, they're meditating, they're studying. When that grace starts to open up inside, it creates more space in your life. And even time takes on a different dimension. Now you can imagine, for the person who realizes the fully realized state of their own being, they begin to live in a timeless zone. And the space in which they're living, which used to be the space of my family, my car, my job, my state, my country, this small planet, that space actually opens up to where they realize, gosh, I'm all space and time. The mystery there is how do they maintain limited individuality in that? When the ocean becomes a drop and the drop realizes its oceanness, how mystical and how magnificent that drop can still function in the world of things and people and all the relationships that they've had, and yet have this enormous expansion of consciousness and perception. Perception changes too. So they're not things that are thought about. These are real experiences for genuine aspirants, genuine sadhakas, genuine yogis and yoginis on the path. And like you said, sometimes we get a glimpse of that. We get a huge glimpse of this expanded nature of our own life. And generally it contracts back again. And that contraction happens due to usually two things: that they weren't vigilant in practice, or they didn't have the knowledge to substantiate that expanded experience. So knowledge and practice have to go hand in hand. It's called Baudhagyan and Purushagyan in Kashmir Shaivism. Baudhagyan means your intellectual understanding of who you are and what's around us. Purushagyan means the inner experience of your own inner nature, your subjective experience, Purusha, your experience of your own soul and how it directly fits in to this drama of our own life. So I think if that covers your question.
No, it does, and it does. And yeah, as you said, there are two sides of the same coin. It seems like that our feeling, whether it's through a glimpse or through our study, that I am the supreme reality, and then confirming that again and again through practice somehow has a very intimate connection as one strengthens the other. In Kashmir Shaivism, there is a word called Svatantrya, right, which refers to freedom. And I noticed that through this practice, I feel that my own creativity or freedom is increasing over time. So I've used that more recently as a benchmark, that if something is limiting my creativity in any pursuit in life, whether it's art or music, then there is more work to be done, or even it's problem solving in day-to-day life. If the creativity is limited, then there is stuff that I need to do.
Yes, Svatantrya is an interesting word. It means freedom, and Svatantrya Shakti, which is a term used often in Kashmir Shaivism, parlance. Svatantrya Shakti means the energy of complete freedom, which is what Shiva and Shakti had. They had complete freedom to create anything they wanted, and they didn't create this universe out of a desire to create a universe and just have fun playing with us in ignorance. It was a spontaneous overflow of this incredible state of love and compassion for that they accepted. They didn't desire, they accepted that this is what's going to flow out. They accepted this stepping down into a state of complete inertia in rocks and trees. Well, trees are not inert, in rocks and mountains and that, up to coming back from that state and re-realizing, recognizing, pratyabhijna, the word, re-recognizing their own nature that they had originally stepped out. And it may take millions of lifetimes. That was part of the spontaneous overflowing in that. And Svatantrya is, at that level, is the complete universal independent freedom. And what happened in that is, in creating a limited individual, i.e. myself, who sees the world as differentiated. I'm different from my friends. I have my own thing. I'm living here in this beautiful house, all my things. But I have a freedom to act within this bubble of my own world. And when we're really entrenched and in stress and everything, that freedom seems very, very limited, and our creativity is limited. Through the practice of meditation or expansion of awareness, our freedom doesn't change because we are free to do anything, but the potential options opens up more and more. When we're bogged down, the options seem to be very limited. When we're happy and free and just really healthy, and we seem to have so many more options available. So there's freedom within restriction. We can't step outside of our bubble unless we have that expanded experience, which is what you're talking about here. Many people actually just step outside of their limited bubble, and then they're squeezed back into their bubble, which, according to Shiva texts, each of our bubbles has a radius of 80 miles in all directions, north, south, east, west, up and down. And think of creation where all these bubbles are overlapping, because there are people who live within my 80-mile radius, probably, 4,000 or 5,000 people, maybe more. And I remember one thing that Swami Lakshman Joo said, that in the days of his practice, because a lot of practice in Kashmir Shaivism is practice in action. You don't have to just sit twice a day formally and just meditate in your room. That's not considered to be the end goal of Kashmir Shaivism. You have to come out of your room and you have to continue with your spiritual practice of maybe just watching your breath or whatever while you're doing the chores of your daily life. And in the beginning, it's the mundane chores that it's easiest to do. Just walking, washing the dishes, driving your car, doing that. You can still have this, as Zen points out, mindfulness of the breath. But when a person does that, what they start to feel is they start to feel the energy that's pulsating within their own bubble. It changes, it softens and everything, but you start to feel the energy around everybody else's bubble too. And Swamiji said, every now and then, he said, you should go and meditate in where there's a big crowd of people and sense and feel that energy. He used to go, when he traveled to visit people, he said he'd like to go to the main railway station in Bombay and sit there. And there was an overview where you can look down on all these people moving. And he said it was fantastic to feel this incredible energy of Shakti pulsating in every body. And to be able to just witness that and feel that it wasn't something that was separate from everybody. Everybody was interconnected by that energy, although living specifically in their different size bubbles, we can say, so, yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of relates to another topic that you have mentioned, which is grace, right? That it is through grace that one becomes interested in the path, and as one rises through the path. And what is paradoxical again is that ultimately one himself or herself is gracing oneself.
Mm. Mm.
Right?
Yeah, in the first book that John Hughes published called Secret Supreme, there was a chapter on grace, and it mentioned that there are 9 different levels of grace. And that was distilled down from one of the chapters in the book that I mentioned, Abhinavagupta, this very illustrious master who 1,000 years ago took all this text and consolidated it into one teaching, and then consolidated that again into a smaller text. He devoted part of chapter 13, it is, on the 27 levels of grace. So the 9 levels of grace come down that there are 3 levels within each of those 9 levels. So you get 3 9s of 27. And he clearly depicted what is the experience of each individual when they experience eight various type of grace. One grace might just be somebody finds a book and they read a book on spirituality, or somebody finds a book on Christianity, and they read the book and they become incredibly devoted to Jesus. That's an internal grace that comes, through, let's say, the Holy Spirit, or through our own inner being, where we wake up. It's like a wake-up call in the world oh, I've been dreaming. I've been completely lost in the world, and there's something else going on here. There's this whole spiritual path. That's it. That's at that level. The next level might be that somebody may even achieve that through some suffering. Something, they lose their job, or there's been so many fires, their house burns down, they lose everything. And at the end of the losing everything, they suddenly turn around and go, well, what did I have in the first place? And I know that from a personal experience, as somebody who lost their house in the Malibu fire, a house that they scrimped and saved for and built themselves, or got designed, and all of a sudden it was gone. And people were afraid to call that person for the first few days. And then somebody did call and said, my God, you must be devastated. And that person said, yeah, I'm sitting here in the auditorium of a high school in the basketball court, and I've never felt so free in all my life. I have nothing, he said. And yet there's an underlying sense of incredible freedom that I can't explain. I wish I was more depressed, but this has opened up some kind of experience within me of what have I been working towards all this time. But I have my wife, I have my children, and we'll start again, So sometimes trauma brings people to an inner, and that's a grace that happens. And there's another level where somebody, even without those experiences, has an experience, like maybe in sleep or something, of this expansive experience that happens. And then they're bent upon finding out what that is. They don't want to study, they don't want to do it. They want to find a teacher who will explain what they've experienced. And of course, Indian philosophy best explains these kind of experiences of consciousness. You can find it in all of the teachings. You can find it in Sufism through Rumi or Hafiz, Idris Shah, all these teachings. And as a side, Sufism and Kashmir Shaivism are very closely related, at least in the boundaries of Kashmir. The Sufi masters and the Kashmir Shaiva masters, Swami Lakshman Joo says, were very, very intimate with one another on the level of their spiritual experience. That's an aside. So somebody has a direct experience. Again, that grace came from within them, because there was nobody else in the room when they were sleeping. It didn't come from a book, but it came from an opening up of consciousness within them. Then there's that's the second level, of which there's 3 levels, or you can say 9 levels. And then the higher levels are where the expansion of consciousness is so great that it remains. It doesn't fade. And those persons just get this experience, and something stays with them. I would use Eckhart Tolle as an example of that. I haven't watched anything that he did for a while, but when he first had his experience, he was overwhelmed, and he couldn't contain himself, but it stayed with him. And his experience is very interesting, because he relates himself very much to the Zen tradition, but his experience was a greater space, a greater living space around him. And he would always say, when people presented a problem, he would say, well, can I be the space in which this can be entertained? Because what his genuine experience was that his consciousness was no longer located in this small structure of his 5 foot, I don't know how tall he is, 5'3", 5'4", 5'8" body, but it penetrated, it emanated out around him as if he was walking in a bubble of silence, i.e. his first book, Silence Speaks. And this experience is not just unique to Eckhart Tolle. Many, many masters have had this experience and greater experiences of silence, and have expressed that to others, that you can also have this, and some masters want to grab you and shake you and say, can't you feel it? But if your heart isn't open through that inner grace, then you can't feel it. You might feel it from the other person, but you have to practice, or grace has to descend automatically from within you in order for you to experience it. And if the grace is intense, you continue on a path towards understanding that to a greater degree. So,
Yeah, beautiful. George, earlier before this conversation, you were speaking and you had given a very beautiful or unique description of grace where you said that, as you were speaking just now, that grace puts you in contact with this expanded state. And once you taste that, then you're hungry to, in whatever way you want to regain that or explore that. And you had said in that context that grace actually opens up time and space for us, in which, for the most part, we're bound up in time and space, and that's where we feel trapped. So I thought that was a very unique way to talk about grace as an opening within time and space, where you can experience the timeless and the spaceless.
yeah. Our perception of the world changes when we have an experience of expansion of the heart, and for many people, it often creates a state of devotion, intense devotion towards either that experience. A person who expresses love and kindness in a moment of great need, the person who's receiving that develops an immediate devotion towards that person. It's absolutely natural, and the intensity of that devotion depends upon the intensity of that experience. And it's devotion, it's the drive within us that carries us either quickly or slowly or medium, sometimes quick, sometimes slow. So devotion is a very big part of the spiritual path. And for some, there's a necessity to be devoted to some things, to some icon or something outside of themselves. And for some, the experience of consciousness, expansion of consciousness is so great. There's an inner feeling of devotion towards that. It's an abstract thing. It's not that they're refuting everything outside, but that is enough for them to be devoted to their spiritual practice because they've tasted the nectar of bliss that came from that expanded inner experience. And both of these are perfectly legitimate. You can't say there's no reality in having devotion towards, in India, the myriads of gods, Ganesh, Hanuman, that will depend upon a person's nature. There's a million Ganesh temples, there's a million Hanuman temples, there's a million temples to Devi, to Durga, to Lakshmi. And this all comes down to the individual prakriti, the individual nature, what's the pradhan, what is the nature of that person to be devoted to. And some will just be devoted to consciousness. They'll say you don't have to go to temples at all. But you can't say that to somebody who needs that external focus on their particular spiritual path. Or somebody who needs to do rituals, somebody who needs to do that to support this. But that's their reality at that time. And Abhinavagupta wrote these beautiful poems and beautiful hymns to illustrate that whatever we're trying to do in the world is an expression of what's happening inside of us on the spiritual path. So it's okay to do all those things, but you must see them reflected in the way that your own mind, your ego, your intellect, and your senses work in the world. And that way you'll see that the flowing of even your senses into the world and back into yourself, even in the simple process of eating, is in fact it's a ritual in itself, and it's a divine ritual.
So, Jordan, in that context, I have a question for you. So, in certain traditions in the Western Hemisphere, and like Neo Advaita and Advaita itself, there is definitely an emphasis on the Jnana Yoga, or the rational path of understanding consciousness. And definitely, as you said, one could be devoted just to consciousness. But still, I feel like that in the same traditions, like in Kashmir Shaivism, as you were mentioning, there are these beautiful texts, classical texts of saints who were amazing Jnana yogis. Bhattanarayana, the book called Stava Chintamani, the magical jewel of devotion, or Shiva Stotavali, the hymns to Lord Shiva. And they were just extreme poetry. And even in Advaita Vedanta, a sage like Ramana Maharshi, who was considered like the apostle of that tradition, wrote very beautiful poetry towards Maudra Machala. And then if you look at other traditions like Sufism, we have Hafiz and Rumi writing poetry that even people who are not spiritual are moved by. So I was wondering if someone who was that elevated, who, let's say, is already enlightened, is this something that's a natural pouring out of them, right? So is there more to just the sadhaka being devoted, but somebody who's already realized it's also devotional to some extent? Maybe not everybody. Would you think that this is the natural outcome of the path?
Have you ever watched children when they're really happy?
I think so.
They dance and they sing, and they don't know why. It just feels like they can't contain the bliss and the joy of what they're doing, especially when two children play together and they're just so, they dance, or they chase one another and they scream, or it's a very natural outpouring of the inability to contain the bliss that is building up inside them. The same, saints are like children, they say. So these great masters who had this experience of the flow, of tasting this universal ocean of bliss, they had no other alternative other than to sing or to write poetry about it. It was the natural expression of that experience spilling over into poetry, into song, into dance, very big part of Indian culture, to express that divinity externally. And you get that in all cultures. It's not something that is unique just to India. That has been going on for, you look at any ancient culture or tradition, they all have their dance, they all have their music. It's really inherent within human nature to express yourself. And there is a state, one of the graces that we talked about, the second most intense grace, is in Sanskrit, it's called Tivra Madhya Shaktipada. Okay, so on the scale of 27 levels of grace, this is 26. When that grace descends on a yogi, on any individual, it can be spontaneous. That yogi exhibits 5 unique qualities. And those 5 qualities, the first one is an intense love of God, whoever their God is, an intense love and devotion towards God. And one of them is they experience a spontaneous ability to express themselves through poetry or song. They also experience this, infinite state of knowledge, a state where they know everything because they're in a universal state. They know everything that is to be known because everything that is to be known came out of that state. There's no effort on them to study it then. That just becomes spontaneous knowledge. And their words, whatever they say, they become truth. If they say, Swami used the example, if the yogi like that says, let this man who's very thin, let him be fattened, he gets fat. Or that's a funny example. That's the one example that came to mind that Swamiji said. But these yogis at that level remain very hidden. Their inner treasure is that this grace has descended upon them, not in so much of a descent from above, but an expression, an opening, an awakening from within. And in that awakening, all the energies that are operating in the external universe, all these what we call Shaktis, that are these wheels of energy that are upholding the universe, they realize are actually going on inside them, as if it's a microcosm. They're a microcosm functioning in this macrocosm. But the unwritten contract with all those Shaktis is they don't want to be exposed. So that master, that yogi, that yogini, that aspirant who has that experience generally remains very internally hidden. Externally, there may be an expression of that, but internally they remain quite hidden from what is the mechanics of their own enlightenment. That's another unique aspect of Kashmir Shaivism. And I once asked Swami Lakshman Joo how many people that he knew of around him and in Kashmir in the last 100 years or so had achieved that level. And he just said, oh, you would be surprised. But they don't express it externally. They're the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. But they're happy to live in that state of universality within the boundaries of their own, what seems to be small world, but they're way beyond that. They're way beyond that in the reality of their consciousness and their perception. That's something I found very comforting about Kashmir Shaivism, that you can reach a state of highly elevated consciousness and spiritual experience, and you don't have to become a teacher, because universal consciousness is universal consciousness, whether you've got 5 disciples, whether you've got no disciples, whether you're a householder with 10 kids, it's universal consciousness. So you absolutely relish and enjoy the play that you've been given, because you've realized that it is a play and that all the expressions in your life are just the expressions of Shiva and Shakti dancing in the world. But the other unique thing about that is that Kashmir Shaivism recognizes that a person in that state, their state is a blessing for the universe. Having achieved that state, it's a silent blessing for the universe.
Yes, that's amazing. And I think what you're hinting at, would love to go a little bit more into it, is the mechanism, as you said, of the functioning of these energies. But maybe before that, as from the very start, you shared the play of Shiva and Shakti, of the divine masculine and feminine, and that itself as an emergence from the ocean of consciousness. So I wanted to check in with you in the current world that we live in. For the last several hundred years, there has been this dominance of patriarchy, right? And it seems to be related to a lot of the issues we had, like capitalism, colonialism, materialism. And now it seems like there might be a change of guards where there is more and more recognition of the divine feminine. Also, many ancient traditions or civilizations had matriarchy as their primary, sort of patriarchy. So I wanted to see, because in Kashmir Shaivism itself, it seems like that Shakti oftentimes has a predominant position. I was wondering if you would share something in that context.
Well, yeah, we'll be touching on this idea of grace. And the descent of grace, or the touch of grace, is called Shakti Pata, the touch of energy, the touch of Shakti that opens up something within you, with whatever it might be. As we say, from all the 27 different levels, it is the energy of grace that opens you up to a greater reality. Now, there is no Shiva Pata. It's Shakti Pata. Shiva can't really grace you, because Shiva is already everywhere. There's nowhere for Shiva to go. He's all pervading. He's consciousness. Shiva is both the transcendental consciousness which emanates into the play of creation. You know, the Sanskrit words are Vishwatirana Vishwamaya, internal state of consciousness expressing itself externally, happening simultaneously at all times, and happening within the blink of Shiva's eyes. You know, Shiva blinks, creation, you know, in that blink, creation is created and destroyed. Because there has to be, you know, there has to be this expansion and contraction taking place. That's the nature of life, expansion and contraction. So in that sense, you know, this Shakti, without Shakti, there would be no Shiva. Without Shakti, without this ability of Shiva's consciousness to rise up in this feminine way and reflect on itself, there would be no Shiva. And that's expressed when creation ends. In the iconography of Indian philosophy, when creation ends, it's depicted as the goddess Kali, goddess of time, dancing on Shiva, Mahakala, the god who is in charge of the expansion of creation. So time dancing on space, because now the space, the things which filled space up, which were Shakti's domain. Shiva is the space. Shakti fills the space up. You know, you buy a house, Shakti decorates the house, decides what's going to go in there. The same way, Shiva and Shakti decorates the universe with this diversity of things. So when the universe, when Shakti decides to withdraw it all back into herself, then the space is no longer filled with things, and the things themselves create the concept of time. Because time only exists when there's some distance between things. If there's no things, then there's no time. So Mahakala, the Lord of time, the Lord of space, lays down. His job is done. He's not dead. Swami says he's not dead. Swami Lakshman Joo tells us those pictures of Kali, he's enjoying the bliss of her feet placed on his body. And she is dancing the dance of drawing all time into herself. So Shakti, yes, Shakti rules supreme. You know, in Shaiva philosophy, there's a very strong tradition in Kashmir, the Shakta tradition, and that is there throughout India, the Shakta tradition. And that's this diversity again. But Shakti plays a very, very important role. In fact, without Shakti, there is no Shiva.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like that would connect to when we began at the very beginning, where you talked about Paramashiva, or consciousness, the ocean of consciousness that's not aware of itself. It's just consciousness, and through which this ability, so to speak, of vimarsha or self-reflection appears as Shakti.
Yes. And in Shaivism, to make it a little more perplexing, that of Paramashiva is considered to be not within the level of tattvas, because it's all pervading. It can't be a specific boundary to that. So it becomes what's called the 37th tattva, just for the sake of understanding. There is no 37th tattva, but it becomes there for the sake of understanding that the universality started outside of this framework of 36 tattvas, which make up the known creation. And Abhinavagupta, who we've mentioned a couple of times now, this great enlightened master of this tradition, in one chapter of his, epic Tantra Loka, he devotes a whole chapter to understanding the expansion of these 36 tattvas out into 118 different levels of creation, 118 different, what are called bhuvanas or lokas, 118 different worlds, and how they fit neatly into the package of the 36 tattvas. And he describes how each one is infinitely bigger than the next until you get up to this mind-boggling bigger. They even have the calculation in yojanas. Yojanas in Kashmir Shaivism, there's different interpretations. It means 8 miles or it means 3,600 miles. The cosmologists go into that in great detail. But it becomes this infinite expanse. And he says, I experienced this in my Samadhi. I experienced this whole gamut of 118 worlds contained within 36 tattvas, contained within 5 egg-shaped circles, he says. And he said, and then I thought, but in the world of Paramashiva, this may be one bubble. Everything I experience may be just be a bubble in the great ocean of Paramashiva. So it's beyond our comprehension. You know, like eternity, for instance. We think we can only think eternity is a very long time because we can only have a framework for that in time. But eternity is this infinite moment of this present moment, which has continued forever. There has never been a time when this present moment didn't exist, past and future. It's not that you would determine the present moment on the basis of there was a past and there was a future. Now I'm in the present moment. The present moment is the eternality of creation.
Yes, wonderful. The present moment is not in time.
Yes.
You just said about the 118 worlds, which is so fascinating, and maybe we can go into that. I wanted to discuss this with you a little bit. Because earlier we were saying, I think it's a quote from John Hughes from the Lakshman Joo Academy, who said that Kashmir Shaivism is the map of our own awareness, or the geography of
The
our own
mystical,
awareness.
the quote was, and it was made quite some time ago, that Kashmir Shaivism is the mystical geography of awareness. It's the map of awareness from completely contracted awareness, limited perception of the world, up to the complete expansion of awareness, where awareness itself becomes the consciousness which was always there behind awareness. You know, because, you know, consciousness, when consciousness becomes conscious, it becomes awareness. Before that, there's no awareness because there's nothing to be aware of. There is only infinite consciousness.
So that is a very, very deep statement, perhaps like a Zen koan. But you had mentioned this to me earlier as well, and it reminded me of a quote that I came across in a book just a couple of nights ago from Nisargadatta Maharaj, who's a very popular or famous Advaita Vedanta teacher, or was. And the quote is that I am is spontaneous imagination, and everything else is just imagination. And it kind of made me feel connected to what you were saying, that he says that this sense of I amness that we have, or awareness that we have, self-awareness, is a spontaneous emergence from something beyond that.
Yeah. I can't speak for his teaching or what he's trying to explain from that level, but I can only speak in terms of what I've learned in the parlance of Kashmir Shaivism, that, you know, that when consciousness expresses itself in the world, it does so by, first of all, becoming conscious of itself. And this back and forward motion is what happens all the way down. You know, consciousness reflecting on itself, expanding, and then reflecting on itself again in a slightly stepping down manner, and then expanding in that, and then again, because there has to be this pulsation. Creation means pulsation, this expansion and contraction that's taking place at all levels, on a universal level, and at minute levels on the individual level, and in our own heartbeat, expanding and contracting. right down to that. It's there. And the reason the breath becomes an important thing is we have expansion and contraction in the breath. We breathe out, we expand ourselves outside. We breathe in, we contract the outside, but we expand the inside. Through this interplay of oxygen and carbon monoxide. And breath is so really important. We touched on last night why breath is important and how breath determines our time-space reality. And in the animal kingdom, animals that breathe very slowly generally live a very long time. The tortoise, who lives for 500 years, breathes incredibly slowly, like one inward breath and one outward breath every half hour or so. Swami Lakshman Joo said there are practices within Kashmir Shaivism where yogis get to such a refined level of breath that their one inward breath takes 30 minutes and their one outward breath takes 30 minutes. And within the flow of that breath, they see the whole of creation manifesting. They see the whole of creation coming back and dissolving within itself. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating how, I think what you're hinting at is this breath is not just the oxygen and carbon dioxide being exchanged, but the subtle breath and how it unravels our perception.
Yeah, it's definitely not. It's called prana. And once it enters the body, this what's called pranana Shakti, the energy of breath, transforms itself into the 5 breaths, which anyone who's been doing yoga will understand. There are the 5 breaths in the body: prana, apana, samana, udana, and vyana. And each of these has a specific function in the body. And they're going on all the time. They're interacting with one another all the time. And even the breath is changing all the time, from one side to the next side of the nostrils. And this is all well written up, documented in yogic philosophy. And
Yes.
Kashmir Shaivism goes into the details of this. So, okay, if breath is the source of life, then everything that must be contained within breath. And in Kashmir Shaivism, there's one chapter again by this great master Abhinavagupta, the 6th chapter, which is all about time and space and how within the breath there are all the planets. There are the days of the week, there's the days of the year, there's the months of the year. These can all be mapped out in just the flow of one inward and outward breath. Again, a fascinating subject. But why is he talking about this? Who cares? I breathe anyway. I don't have to know all the details. But Abhinavagupta says, if you know even about this geography of awareness, then you have a map. And as you traverse along that map, you know exactly where you are. And if you know exactly where you are, you won't take a wrong turn and turn back. You won't fall backwards. You'll keep heading in the direction of the mountain of spirituality that you're trying to climb. So this term, mystical geography of awareness, and I said, John, I think that you phrased that term, and he said it was so long ago, I don't remember. But yeah, it's an apt term to describe Kashmir Shaivism for sure.
Yes, and since you're mentioning breath, I mean, it's fascinating. I don't think there is any tradition on the planet, the genuine spiritual tradition, that doesn't talk about the basis of breath. It's in the indigenous tradition, spiritual traditions like shamanism, the word spirituality, as you were saying, and even the word soul and atma. I recently discovered that the etymology is connected with atmosphere and breath again. So, it's amazing that Kashmir Shaivism provides these methodologies to extend the breath and discover within the breath time and space itself, and mechanisms to modulate our perception, which is so scientific. It almost seems like in a way you were studying quantum physics with physics, but it's not just a study. It matches with the shift in perception to directly experience these changes.
Well, another aspect of that, just not looking at the breath, but looking at speech. Kashmir Shaivism, to my knowledge, it has gone into the most subtle ramifications of speech and how speech actually works, not just in the fact that there are 4 levels of speech, which they talk about, the speech which rises up inside us, comes from the heart, goes to the throat, goes to the space here, and comes out out of our mouth as speech. But what is speech made of? Speech is made of sentences. Sentences are made of words. Words are made of letters. They brought it back to the alphabet as the source of all speech. And the Malini Vijaya Tantra, this Tantra is trying to understand the reality of Malini. In Kashmir Shaivism, there are 2 Sanskrit alphabets. There's one which is the standard Sanskrit alphabet of like the vowels, and then the consonants, separate from that, 16 vowels, 34 consonants, making up 50 letters. But then there's another alphabet within Kashmir Shaivism, that's called Matrika. There's another alphabet called Malini, which is a mixture of the letters all together, like you would say an alphabet soup, where you look down on your plate and all the letters are mixed. The consonants and the vowels are mixed up together. And Abhinavagupta, this master, has gone into this in detail in the 3rd chapter of his book and devoted about maybe 100 verses on understanding what is this Matrika chakra? What is this energy of letters which express itself in words and eventually express itself out of sentences as I'm speaking and as we've been speaking? And he breaks it down into how that happens, how that works in the body. It's when I first came across it, because I was very interested in Sanskrit from the beginning. As soon as I heard any Sanskrit verses, I went, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing!" The sound of these slokas, the sound of these verses being sung in different meters. It resonated with me immediately, and I had to go and just enroll in a Sanskrit course at the university straight away. I was in my early 20s. I had to know what this language was. And fortunately, I had an incredible teacher who for the first 6 weeks just walked around the room reciting the alphabet. And half the students were gone by the end of the 3rd week. They were bored. But he walked around the room. He said, "Repeat after me. And for me, it was, I would leave there, high. It was amazing. And others go, "Why is he just going on about this?" But he wanted us to become the vibrations of that Sanskrit alphabet before we embarked on understanding grammar and that. And I would never consider myself to be a Sanskritist that I would sit down and translate. But I love the language, and I love the vibration of the language and that vibration of the letters and the words that come up. And no tradition has gone into it, to my knowledge, as deeply as Kashmir Shaivism.
Yes, I mean, that is another very incredible subject that Kashmir Shaivism as a whole topography on, and which is language mysticism. And it reminds me how I believe it's in the Bible. First it was the Word, and the Word was one with God, and the Word was God. And sound and mysticism, particularly, again, there is a connection with music. I know on the Indian subcontinent, there have been musical masters like Tansen and some other masters who would just transmit this knowledge, deep knowledge, just directly through music. And of course, it's legend, but one can see how we're moved into higher vibrations of expansiveness, even through pop music at times. And what I understand is that, as you're explaining, that language has these levels, and Sanskrit in particular is one of those languages that is above the spoken language and has the ability to form various combinations which can transmit higher truths to a sadhaka, to a practitioner, or someone who might not even be practicing and just gets to hear that.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true of Sanskrit. It's considered to be phonetically the perfect language, because the sound of the letters doesn't change independent of where they are in words. there's all these rules and Sunday rules and everything, but the letters themselves remain phonetically perfect. And,
Right.
that's true. I'm just wondering,
Should we take a break?
yeah, I think so. I think it'll be quite a while.
Yeah, let's pause this and I'll join you there and we can figure it out.
Okay. Yep.
Is it on your side?
Yeah.
Okay. So George, some other traditions that come to mind that seem to recognize this language mysticism or the mystical aspect of sound are also the indigenous traditions, the Kabbalistic tradition, and the Jewish, and I know in Sufism it is there as well. In the indigenous tradition, which is a little bit I know, and I felt a little touched in their music, it seems that they connected with the sounds of nature. It could be the sounds of the birds, the animals, and even the sounds perhaps of the landscape and the terrain. And that again goes to pre-verbal language. And so could you share something about these higher levels?
I think it's pretty well explained in this idea in Kashmir Shaivism of the 4 levels of speech. And in Sanskrit, they're called para, supreme level of speech, which is kind of beyond speech. That's like consciousness before it rises up. Then there's pashanti, and literally the word pashanti means seeing. Then there's madhyama, which means in between, and there's the words that we speak. So that the actual sounds of what we're saying. So para, pashanti, madhyama, and vaikhari. And in all species, whatever sounds are being made, they come through these 4 levels. So they come through para, they come from that source, because all, even the animal kingdom is connected with consciousness. It's not separate. And they express themselves through pashanti, meaning, what I see. But pashanti doesn't have any formal thought yet about what I'm seeing. It's just a process of seeing, pure perception. Madhyama, on the other hand, is where the mind begins to piece together what I'm seeing and picks out of that what I want to do with what I'm seeing. And then Vaikhari is what we say. This is happening right now as I speak. It's happening every time somebody, even if we don't speak, we're still speaking in our mind. We're still speaking inside of our head. That continual dialogue is going on for probably the time that we're awake. And each thought that's generated goes through those phases. Take the animal kingdom, for instance, and we talked about this a little last night. Animals, like a crow or a raven, it only has 3 or 4 different levels of sound, we can say, that we can hear. Ah, ah, ah. But because that animal, that bird is expressing what it's seeing, inherent within that is the sentence, which is it's translating to everybody that hears that sound, especially in the animal kingdom, and to yogis, what that animal is saying. They're basically saying what they're seeing. And it's a very fascinating subject, this whole subject of para, pashanti, madhyama, and vaikhari, that there are the 4 levels of speech. And I once had a wonderful experience with Swamiji where there's a tradition in Kashmir of throwing rice to the birds on a Saturday, a yellow rice. And the lady came out after lunch and she threw that rice. We were just sitting on this veranda. There was an open garden there, grass. Threw the rice out, and these 2 minor birds came down and started eating. And they were the minor birds that had nested very close in one part of Swamiji's house, right in the corner of that veranda. But pretty soon the word got around and there were 20 or 30 birds all eating the rice. And these two minor birds flew back up. We watched this together. These two minor birds flew back up, sat on this little wire railing and sort of were looking at one another. And all of a sudden, they flew down and started squawking really loud. Wow, wow, wow. That's all you heard. And all the other birds flew away. They flew away immediately. The minor birds also flew away, went back up onto the wire, waited about a minute or two, and then went back down and started eating the rice alone of what was left. Swamiji himself was sitting there watching intently. He started laughing, just laughing as if someone had just told him a good joke. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you know what those birds just did?" And I said, "Swamiji, I don't understand, that level of pashanti." He said, "Those two birds were so upset that everyone else was going to eat their rice because they figured this was their territory. They went up and made a plan. When they flew down, they yelled out, 'Quick, quick, here comes a cat.' And all the other birds boarded and they all flew away." And it was just a perfect example that this pashanti, this expressing what you see, even in the animal kingdom, it goes across the different species, and that's been filmed. An animal calling in pain, another animal will come from somewhere else and save them, but they know exactly what's being said because it's like a picture. They're seeing the movie of what's happening through the sounds that those creatures are making. Dogs bark, they don't have a huge vocabulary. They bark, and different dogs bark different pictures, but they're actually expressing what they're seeing, or they're whimpering because of what they're seeing. It's cats tell you exactly what's going on all the time, but they only have, how many meows do they have? It's a fascinating science. And Swamiji had said that yogis, they understand the animal kingdom. They understand what's being said.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. And that again connects me to some of the Native American and other traditions where they were in much more harmony and communication with the animals.
Yeah.
Through these vocalizations and stuff. And also in music, again, that becomes very apparent at times, especially in the Indian traditions. There seem to have been yogis and masters who just could transmit through their musical instrument.
Yes. And the effect that music has on nature. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Another very interesting thing that you said that I'm curious to learn about is that you said in this interview, in our conversation, that the Shaktis, these energies, are also within us. And the enlightened master, the enlightened human being who becomes aware of that keeps it hidden, but expresses it in a different way. So maybe could you say more about how is it that the human vessel itself is built with these various energies?
Yeah, absolutely. And when the physical body dies, it breaks down fairly quickly. And the life force, which is the source of these energies, remember we said it was Shakti, energy. The literal translation of Shakti is energy that rose up in the form of awareness for this ocean of consciousness to be aware of itself. And then it just flowed out like a dam overflowing into the rest of creation through breath. So the energy of breath is intimately connected with these Shaktis. And the Shaktis enter us when our first breath takes place. And it's the play of these Shaktis within these energies bouncing around. And there's infinite number of energies that are out there in the cosmos. And there's infinite number of energies within us. But it's brought down to, basically 50 salient energies, which are the energies of the letters of sound in the Sanskrit alphabet. And they have classes. They have these vargas, these classes of energies, of which certain energies, feminine energies, own certain letters of the alphabet even. And they function within us all the time in the letters becoming words, becoming sentences. So the physical body, the human body for every human being, and also the bodies of animals, have these energies functioning. And this is how we have this term, the microcosm of a macrocosm. Exactly how we function in the world, in our perception and our ability to move around freely in our small, limited world, is the same mechanics of how Shiva and Shakti come out and flow into creation and move about in creation in this infinite number of energies. And it's the light of consciousness which is continually on, this light of consciousness that we talked about, that you see in dream state, although there's no light in the room, but you still see your dreams. This light of consciousness is like the light from within us that projects the world around us through our senses, kind of like the idea of a hologram. You know, this light is coming down, it's projecting from within us, and through these energies, these Shaktis, is projecting the world around us at every moment. And that projection of the world around us stops when we change our levels of consciousness. When we fall asleep, we're not aware that we're in bed sleeping, we're asleep. But we are aware sometimes that we're dreaming. So we're in another world there. We're projecting that dream onto the screen of our consciousness. So that, again, that is an amazing thing to think about, that and it's been said many times in many traditions, we're a microcosm of the macrocosm. And that's very much brought out in the whole understanding of Kashmir Shaivism, that you should never feel that something that's happening out there is independent of you. We're continually creating, maintaining, and destroying our own reality, 24/7.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because it almost reminds one of contemporary physics, right? Where there's this idea of the holographic universe, that there is at every level, the universe is complete in a sense of a hologram. But the same processes that are happening at the macrocosm are also happening in the microcosm.
Yeah, i.e. the great interest in the science of non-duality, which has been now going for quite some time, and people expressing these whole ideas of quantum physics through the paradigm of spiritual experience, and I find that Kashmir Shaivism as a teaching is the perfect foundation for understanding how consciousness comes into the world, how the quantum state becomes manifest, from so-called nothingness into somethingness. But the reality for Shaivism is it never was nothingness. It was nothingness full of somethingness. But in order for it to become something, there had to be this rising up of this tide of energies to reflect on itself. These are grandeur concepts to entertain.
Yes, no, this is brilliant, because I think what this gives us, the audience, and to me, is a possibility to know where to begin exploring these fascinating subjects, and also that this is not just a head science, but an actual science that brings this knowledge into one's own experience.
Yeah, at every level, it can be, empirically verified. That you can actually, understand it theoretically, and you can understand it experientially, because it's as John Hughes likes to say, this is our own story. It's not somebody else's story. This is the story of how we function in the world and how the world around us is in many ways our teacher in continually bringing up situations where we can understand ourselves more deeply. Sometimes
Right.
those situations are not so pleasant. Sometimes they are pleasant. It's the restless path of a seeker for many, wanting to just this unscratchable itch that's there. But we know it's inside. We know it's somewhere. We just have to get to that, and practice is really, really, really the salient feature for the majority of people in this world, unless you're an incredibly blessed soul and suddenly you grace yourself through the divine grace of and you're enlightened in just a moment. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, George, we've definitely been going for quite some time. Thank you so much. And I did want to maybe wrap up with some of the themes that we touched on. And when you're talking about these energies, when we in Kashmir Shaivism, you mentioned the Krama system, which is one of the schools, and you mentioned the 12 Kalis, which is a whole system of unraveling our perception of space and time. At least that's the way I understand it. And so my question would be that when we're working with these energies, or when a sadhaka practitioner works with this particular transmission of the 12 Kalis, are we invoking these energies, these goddesses within our very own being, or simultaneously within and without?
I think it's a good thing to understand that, and it's a concept that Swami Lakshman Joo brings about continuously through his teachings, is it's not so much that we're invoking God. It's not as much so much as we're trying to get inside ourselves to realize God, or whatever way you want to look at it, consciousness. It's actually that consciousness or God is trying to get out. It's a completely, it's looking in the mirror where, the right side of your face is the left is the right. And it's reversed. And when we say we have this idea of invoking, we feel that I can sit down and invoke, the 12 Kalis or Goddess Durga or something, and she will come and bless me. But actually the practice of just watching the breath enlivens the reality that's already there within us, and those goddesses or those masculine and female energies invoke us. There's a whole thing about, I'm going to do a course to raise my Kundalini. Actually, Kundalini raises you. You don't raise Kundalini. Kundalini is a recognition of something that has always been happening within you. But what is happening for Kundalini to rise, and Swami is very, very, because Kundalini is a very big part of Kashmir Shaivism. Kundalini rises not through any particular thing that you're doing or any particular practice, but in reaching the state of complete and utter surrender, which means you've surrendered your breath to that inner consciousness. And when the breath stops, then automatically Kundalini rises. You can't make it rise. It is the maker of its own rise. You can do practices which are conducive, but if you're sitting there trying to practice and raise your Kundalini, you can have all sorts of experiences and imaginations of what's happening. And you can feel energies rising up and going up and down your spinal column. But if it rises automatically and majestically through the inner energy of Kundalini Shakti, then you realize that it rose by itself through simply one-pointed awareness of meditation. And this is a very big point that Swami Lakshman Joo made. There is a YouTube clip that he made in an interview that he had with an American yoga teacher, where he says that I believe that a lot of the Kundalini that's talked about in the world today is purely imagination. And that the real thing rises when that one-pointedness becomes so one-pointed that the energy in the breath actually stops. And in that stoppage of the breath, the 5 breaths which are functioning in the body all the time suddenly get consumed in the breath of pradana, or pranana Shakti. And that pranana Shakti is intimately connected to Kundalini, the energy of life force. So that's quite a different perspective or take on Kundalini. And so it's also a different way of saying, that these practices that we can do, the main practice that we must do is a practice that brings us into a greatest expanded state of awareness, not in the desire to sit and have some fantastic spiritual experience. Because if you're waiting to have something to happen, it doesn't. The anxiety and innocence in the practice is if each time you sit down to meditate or do whatever practice you're doing, you have this idea that this is the first time I've ever done it. I don't know what to expect. I'm not expecting any results. I'm just doing according to what I've been instructed to do. That's the best way to dive really deep into more expanded states of your own inner nature. So you can look at it 2 ways. Am I invoking the goddess, or is the goddess revealing herself to me through my own vigilance and my own devotion for my one-pointed practice?
And that's beautiful. That also reminds me of Swami Lakshman Joo oftentimes saying that when you begin the practice, you should already assume, you should begin with the standpoint that you're already that supreme reality.
Yeah, that God consciousness is everywhere. There's nowhere to go. It's not in some 7th heaven. It is everywhere. And I'm sitting, and I'm the center of my own God consciousness, which is expanding from me. And then go on with your practice. But do practice, he would say, do practice. And do practice in activity. Very important in Shaivism. Take some time during the day when you go for your quiet walk with your dog or whatever you do. Just watch your breath and be aware of that. And, Swamiji was always like, I asked him once, I said, so, how long should I do this practice? And he looked at me and smiled. He said, until you're enlightened, which meant we have a tendency to feel that there is a formal time that we do our yoga asanas and our yoga practice and our meditation. And they're separate from the rest of our life. When we're doing the mundane chores of washing clothes or washing the dishes and all the general household duties. And for the real serious practitioner of Shaivism, if you start to incorporate that awareness during the actions that you do during the day, you will find that this division between formal practice and daily activity starts to dissolve. And that's a wonderful experience for people to find that, wow, I can now practice anytime. I can practice while I'm tying my shoes. I can practice while I'm driving to the supermarket. I can practice, very difficult to practice when you're in the supermarket trying to decide what you want to buy. But in the beginning, it's very easy to do with just very simple things. And Swami Lakshman Joo emphasized the first one you should try is just walking quietly. But don't walk talking to someone else in your walk and everything. Talking is an obstruction in the beginning, because when you talk, your breath is disturbed. Later on, he said, when you get established in this practice, you can talk and still be aware of the breath moving even while you're talking. But that's a more advanced stage. And that requires vigilant practice in the beginning. And why are we watching the breath? Why do that? It seems so simple, seems so ridiculous. I'm breathing already. We're only doing that because that is the connecting rod between our limited state of life and this universal state of what that we're aspiring to find out about, which is the nature of our own reality. And I would finish that with the one quote that Swamiji said that's on our website, the Universal Shiva Fellowship website and the Lakshman Joo Academy website, is that one of the quotes which Claudia put up there, she's our master of technology, God and the individual are one. To realize this is the essence of Kashmir Shaivism. So that's it in a nutshell. And it's not complicated. We make it complicated because we want to try this practice and that practice, but we have to come back to one salient practice that's producing results. And that's yeah.
Yeah, that's really beautiful and very practical advice for someone who's treading this path. Maybe as a last thing that you touched on earlier was you mentioned the 36 thought was in 118 worlds.
I was just laughing because I thought that was the last thing. But anyway, let's keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the 118 worlds, and you talked about this philosopher, the giant of Kashmir Shaivism, Abhinav Gupta, saying that this is how much I've explored, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I couldn't help but relate this to our current paradigm, the civilization we are in. And one of the recent shifts that I was earlier sharing with you before this conversation is that suddenly the idea, at least in the West, of extraterrestrials, aliens, and UFOs has become legitimate and is being openly studied. Very recently, the Pentagon released like 400 classified videos of their Navy and fighter pilots who had observed phenomena they could not explain. And that has been like kind of for the first time they came, and it's not taboo. It's like, oh, we just don't know what this is. And people are now studying it at Harvard and Stanford. And yeah, so it's quite fascinating. I mean, in Eastern traditions, this has always been the case, that there are other beings, that are other realms, and they can come in our perception. So I was just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. I feel like Kashmir Shaivism, or would you agree that Kashmir Shaivism provides us with tools that can enhance our perception through cosmic exploration?
Yeah, I will quote again Abhinav Gupta in this 8th chapter of the book that he wrote, Tantra Loka. Tantra Loka means Tantra Aloka. Aloka means to shed light on a particular system. The Tantra means a particular system of knowledge. So in that, he says that the earth element of the first of and grossest of the 36 elements is so vast that out of the 118 worlds that are contained within all the 36 elements, 16 of them exist just within our, earth element. And we're talking about a huge, amphitheater here, if we want to use it, a huge area of space where our solar system is just a very small part. And he points out that there are 16 levels within that, and that our known universe that we know, our solar system and all the planets, is number 6. So there are 5 below us, and there's 10 above. And on each of these levels, there are different levels of intelligent beings. And in Swamiji's Kashmiri rendering of this text, he even went on to describe some of the worlds that he visited in his practice, and saw, even describing some of the beings. Now, how this relates to UFO thing, and in the Western world, we'd be naive to think we're the only beings in this whole universe. It's so vast. But the whole UFO concept has been, I think, chiseled and fashioned into an idea that we should be afraid of, anything outside. And we don't know. There's all these theories about this has happened, that has happened, but we don't know. En masse, the Earth has never been attacked by, and some stories have said that sometimes these encounters have been favorable for people. So I think we have to wait and see. But as for going there, the question was asked to Swamiji. He said, Swamiji, so can we travel to these other worlds? And he said, they're so vast in space and time that even the most developed technology that we have, you would run out of petrol before you even got to the next world. You'd run out of fuel. He said, but you can go when you enter the other dimension of consciousness, which we're not disconnected from, and you can go to all these 180 worlds just as Abhinavagupta did. You can go there in the state of what's called Samadhi, because there you have access to infinite direction, infinite space. You there you transcend limited time, the limited time boundary that we live in. And there's stories in the Puranas and the stories in the Yoga Vashishta that I remember, where some saint or some celestial being came down and took this lady who was mourning on the death of her husband to some other world and showed, look here, in this other world, there's your husband, and and it's you're living in a hut. And she sort of scratched her head, realized it was her in a different form, then went to some other world and showed that all this happening simultaneously, and got really confused. And I may be confusing two stories here, because when that person, they went to all this stuff, and then the person said, oh, well, I want to go back now. They said, oh, well, I'm sorry, but 350 million years have already passed on Earth. It only felt like we've been there for half a day traveling around, but all these millions of years. So time boundary is there, but Abhinavagupta said you can travel to these worlds. You can perceive it within yourself. But that takes, and that isn't something that you can will to do. That's something that would happen spontaneously with the refinement of one-pointed practice and the expansion of your own consciousness. Because again, we're never separated from that universal state. The universal state is pulsating in each and every one. And it's the light of consciousness behind every perception, every thought, every action that we do. And yet we still have the freedom to ignore that or to utilize that knowledge for our own spiritual practice.
Oh, thank you. I think earlier on you had actually mentioned that in Kashmir Shaivism, the various realms can have an entirely different perception of time. What appears to be one day for a human could be a much shorter blink of an eye at another level.
Yes. We know that. And that's clearly pointed out in not just Kashmir Shaivism, but Hinduism in general. We've just passed through a period of time, which ended last Sunday, actually, a 2-week period, which is called Pitripaksh. And it's the period of the ancestors, our deceased ancestors. During that 2-week period, look for some recognition from us. It doesn't matter whether you're a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian, an atheist, whatever. We all have people that we came into this world through, our parents. We have our grandparents and great-grandparents. And what this period of time is set aside for is for recognition that they have now moved on and are now living in some other realm. We may not know the realm, but it's understood in Hinduism that when a soul leaves this world, our first year for that soul's departure is 1 day for that soul to travel to their new destination. And that's why for the first 11 days, they say you have to do a certain ceremony or recognition every day for 10 or 11 days. It varies. And after that, you have to do a particular ceremony every month for 12 months. Because during that period of time, that soul, while they're traveling, wants to feel comforted that people haven't just forgotten them point blank. That they're recognizing that this person has contributed much to their life. Might be your mother. How much more can a mother contribute to a person's life, a son's life or a daughter's life? So that period of time is different for that soul. And they spend 1 day traveling to their designation. And down on earth here, it's 1 year. And that's well known in Indian philosophy, that you organize a priest from your local temple every month on the same day, the same lunar day that person passed away, to do a particular ceremony called a Shraddha ceremony. And in that, it's beautiful. They do certain things. Then they offer some food to animals. They offer who are supposed to be connected with the sky. So the person who did pass on gets some blessing, something. So yeah, that time. And then if you go beyond those worlds to the worlds, the more refined worlds, the time frame again expands. It could be 11,000 years. There is 1 year here. Oh, sorry, 11,000 years here is 1 day there. It boggles the mind to understand how this whole time frame works. But the time frame for us is directly connected to our breath. And when the breath stops, time also stops. Our perception of time stops. In the state of samadhi, it's timeless. There is no time.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And, in the context of the question that I asked about UFOs, I think I recently had an interview with Keith Thompson, who was a phenomenal journalist in this area for many decades. And one of the things is that this culture here in the West does not have any context for the myriad kinds of UFO phenomena and experiences that happen. Because he has been drawing parallels, him and many others are drawing parallels between near-death experiences, shamanic experiences, spiritual experiences, which are unfortunately classified under the single umbrella of UFO phenomena at times. So Kashmir Shaivism provides a very rich cosmology, again, in which things don't have to be dismissed.
Yeah, an inner experience. But, within Indian philosophy, I think it's in I could be corrected, in the Atharva Veda, there is mention in those days of spacecraft, and even certain drawings, vimanas they're called. You can look that up on you can Google that, spacecraft in ancient India. And it wasn't that it wasn't recognized, but vimanas and all of these things, and how these, if you go back to these classic epics of Indian mythology, you hear these stories of these great wars and how these gods flew around in these aerial carriages, and and we treat that as that's just mythology. But there is writings within the Vedas that these things did exist, that they had this technology there of transportation. But Swami Lakshman Joo says the quickest way to travel is in your mind. No fuel consumed, no footprint on the planet. Just you can go into samadhi, you can understand. I mean, there's two kinds of spiritual aspirant in this world, and that's also depicted in Tantra Loka. There are those who are interested in the spiritual world and finding the reality of their own nature or God, but they're also interested in the world. They find the world very fascinating. And therefore, these people want to know and want to dissect, and even in their spiritual practice, they want to experience these things in the world. Then there's the other ones who just, okay, I've had enough of the world. I just want to meditate and find who I am and find God. I'm no longer interested in fast cars and movies and all this kind of stuff. Had enough of that. Been there, done that. Let me now, realize my own. And these are the people that are given to meditation, and these are the perfect people for renunciate kind of activities. Go and live in a monastery. Go and live in an ashram, and enjoy the opportunity to meditate 24/7 without having to involve yourself in the world. That works for some people because that's their nature. But others want to be in the world, and it seems that in Kashmir Shaivism, at least in Kashmir, there was never a strong renunciate tradition in Kashmir. The Shankaracharya went there, but it never took firm roots in Kashmir. There was a very ancient Buddhist tradition there, but it's always been a tradition of practice your spiritual practice, but enjoy the world, because in feeding your senses with good things, entertaining things, good music, very sattvic, pure food, good environment, good visual things, it nourishes your inner energies, and that in itself enhances your spiritual practice. That they're not seen as an obstacle or an illusion or Maya. They're seen as opportunities for you to enrich yourself, enrich your senses, and gain a state of greater understanding. That the world is a commentary, this objective world, as again, Swami Lakshman Joo's own words, this objective world around you is a commentary of God consciousness. And you'll realize that through regular one-pointed practice of whatever meditation you're doing. Your audience will be from so many different traditions. Each tradition is legitimate within itself, as long as the practice itself brings you to a greater understanding of yourself and a feeling of independence within your spirituality.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing light to cosmic exploration, being and becoming. Well, George, thank you. This has been such an illuminating conversation. You've shed light on so many deep themes that perhaps would require several lifetimes of study. And I think that's the beauty of today's conversation, to give the listeners an idea of what is possible in this highly sophisticated and rich tradition of Kashmir Shaivism. So thank you again, and maybe on a closing note, if people are interested and they want to reach out or they want to study Kashmir Shaivism, I know that you are deeply involved with the Lakshman Joo Academy that has published several of Swamiji's books and continue to spread his teachings in the world. So would you like to say something of how people can get started or can get access to these teachings?
Yeah, I think that you would probably put up a link to the website. There's two websites, lakshmanjooacademy.org and universalshivafellowship.org. And we've been now for more than 2 years, we've been running a free Saturday webinar. We finished the Bhagavad Gita, so, there, and then we started on this mystical hymns of Utpaladeva, the devotional hymns of Shiva. And we've had an average, it fluctuates between 80 and 100, 120 people. Initially, 700 people registered, but that's because it was a free Sangha. We decided that we should do something for sincere spiritual seekers during the pandemic. And it took 2 years, exactly, April 2020 to April 2022, to finish the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita. And each week we would play a short, clip, 2 10-minute, 15-minute clips, which were, fortunately for us, recorded on video by John Hughes back in 1990, just 1 year before Swami Lakshman Joo left this world. And it was an amazing experience for people listening. It was an amazing experience for us, for John Hughes, Denise Hughes, Shana Hughes, who gave us the inspiration, for Claudia and myself, putting this together. And as soon as it finished, everybody went, "Oh no, you can't just drop us into a void now. What will we do next?" And then we decided we would do this more devotional text. And that's the same group that's been hanging in there. And it's a free, you can go onto the website, you register for that. And every Saturday morning, Saturday Pacific time, US, and we have people from all over the world watching, and the replays are all there. All the replays for that last 2 years are there, available, accessible. If someone wants to hear what the Bhagavad Gita is in terms of the translation made by Abhinavagupta, that's a unique document. That's a very unique teaching. So that's the best way to find out about this. And The website also mentions that there have been now 11 books published, like 12 by now, lost count, 12 books, and 7 of those, or 9 of those are now the audio transcripts, and the audios come out free. If you buy the book, you get the transcript, and in the back page there's an ability to download the audio for free, so you can read and listen along with what was given out to John of the East, during that period of 16 years. It's really a wonderful way to learn and hear it from the words of a master who's connected to this incredible 5,000-year-old oral tradition.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, definitely. We'll put the links both to the Saturday gathering and the bookstore and the Lakshman Joo Academy in the description below to this video. And yeah, thank you. I've been part of some of these gatherings, and I've read some of these books with you, and it's just incredible, the purity of the transmission and the level and the quality of the work. So thank you again for being patient for such a long time, George.
Yes.
And look forward to speaking to you soon.
Okay. God bless. And
God bless.
Yeah, God bless to your audience.
Thank you.